There is something almost hypnotic about watching a great thing slowly fall apart. Not in a cruel way, more in the way you might stare at an old photograph and trace the lines of something that used to be whole. Family Guy was, at one point in its life, genuinely one of the most interesting and inventive comedies on American television. And then, season by season, almost imperceptibly at first and then with gathering speed, it became something else entirely. Something hollowed out. Something that kept the shape of the original but lost whatever was living inside it. This is going to be a long, slow walk through that story. The rise, the collapse, the in-between years where people kept hoping it would find its way back. Get comfortable. Settle in. Because this is not a short story, and the best way to tell it is the unhurried way, the way you tell any story worth telling. One thing at a time. Part 1. What Family Guy was. Before it was anything else. To understand what went wrong with Family Guy, you have to first understand what went right. And what went right was almost everything, at least in the beginning. The year is 1998. A young animator named Seth MacFarlane, fresh from working on shows like Johnny Bravo and Dexter's Laboratory at the Hanna-Barbera studio, sits down to pitch a cartoon to the Fox network. He is 24 years old. He has been working on 2 short animated films of his own, little passion projects called The Life of Larry and Larry and Steve, featuring a middle-aged everyman and his weirdly intelligent dog. Fox executives watch the pitch, nod at the right moments, and then greenlight the whole thing. MacFarlane is handed a budget and a mandate and told to turn his idea into a series. The show that comes out of that process is called Family Guy. It premieres on the 31st of January 1999, in a slot that networks dream about securing the post-Super Bowl window, right after tens of millions of people have just watched Super Bowl 33. The first episode pulls in around 22 million viewers. For a brand new animated comedy on a Sunday night, that number is staggering. Now, a chunk of that audience was always going to tune in simply because they were already watching their televisions and had not yet gotten up to find the remote. That is the honest thing to say about post-Super Bowl viewership. But even after that initial flood of passive watching fades, Family Guy holds on. It builds a real audience of people who came back specifically because of what they saw. What they saw was the Griffin family: Peter, the father; Lois, the mother; Meg, the oldest daughter; Chris, the son; Stewie, the baby; and Brian, the dog. What made this family interesting right from the start was not that each of them was funny on their own, though they were. It was the way they balanced each other. The show had an internal logic to its character dynamics that a lot of animated comedies never quite manage. Peter was the chaos engine, the lovable, genuinely dim-witted father who made catastrophically bad decisions with the cheerful confidence of a man who has never once doubted himself. Lois was the tether, the one who watched Peter's disasters from a place of exhausted but genuine love and tried to hold the household together. Meg was the ordinary one, the teenager who wanted nothing more than to be noticed in a family where being noticed required competing with an evil baby and a talking dog. Chris was the sweet, clueless son. Not dumb in the mean way, but dumb in the way that very gentle people sometimes are, just not particularly connected to the world's sharper edges. Brian was the intelligent, slightly pretentious family dog who drank too much and wanted very much to be taken seriously as a writer. And then there was Stewie. Stewie deserves his own breath of attention here, because Stewie Griffin was unlike anything else on television in 1999 or really at any point before or since. He was a 1-year-old baby. He wore a little yellow shirt. He sat in a high chair and ate strained peas. And he was, underneath all of that, a criminal mastermind with a refined British accent and an abiding obsession with world domination and the murder of his own mother. The comedy of Stewie was rooted in pure contrast. The gap between what he looked like a chubby, wobbly infant who needed someone to wipe his chin and what he was actually doing, which involved constructing laser cannons in his bedroom closet and monologuing about the enslavement of humanity, was the entire joke. And it never ran out of air in those early seasons because MacFarlane and his writing team kept finding new angles on that contrast, new ways to place Stewie's outsized villainy against the backdrop of ordinary domestic life. He would be plotting his mother's destruction while she buckled him into a car seat. He would be unveiling a weather control device while Brian tried to take him for a walk. The mundane and the monstrous kept colliding, and every collision was funny. Brian was the other secret weapon of those early years. He was the voice the audience was supposed to share, the intelligent, wryly observant presence who looked at all the chaos surrounding him and reacted the way any reasonable person would. He and Peter had one of the best comic friendships on television during that era. The dynamic between them was a slow, warm pendulum. Peter would come up with some catastrophic idea. Brian would explain, calmly and with considerable precision, exactly why it was a catastrophic idea. Peter would ignore him. Things would explode, metaphorically and occasionally literally. Brasidians to help with the cleanup. What made the early seasons work as something more than just an animated gag delivery system was the heart underneath all of it. The Griffins were genuinely a family. They fought, they embarrassed each other. Peter made enormous messes. Lois sometimes lost her patience. Meg got ignored. But underneath all of that, they loved each other. Episodes in those first 3 seasons would end with apologies, with hugs, with Peter standing in the living room telling Lois he was sorry and meaning it. The emotional weight of those resolutions was real. Small, sure, quiet, but real. You believed that this chaotic, ridiculous family actually cared about what happened to each other. The writing in seasons 1 through 3 had a quality that is hard to name but easy to feel when you encounter it. Everything felt intentional. The jokes had layers. A cutaway gag, which was already a signature part of the show's identity from the very first episode, would be short and sharp, a quick lateral leap to something absurd, a joke that worked precisely because it was unexpected and brief, and then a clean return to the main story. The cutaways were not the meal. They were seasoning on top of a meal that was already satisfying on its own terms. You could watch an episode from season 2 and follow a complete, properly structured story with a beginning, a middle, and an end, and the cutaways would be sitting inside that structure like little surprise bonuses rather than load-bearing walls. MacFarlane surrounded himself with strong writers in those early years. Chris Sheridan, Danny Smith, Gary Janetti, Ricky Blitt, Neil Goldman, Garrett Donovan, Matt Weitzman, and Mike Barker all contributed to the tone of those first 3 seasons. MacFarlane himself was deeply, personally involved in every layer of the production. He was voicing 4 major characters, Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire, and simultaneously overseeing the writing direction, the animation choices, the overall creative vision. When you watch those early episodes today, you can feel a single, coherent sensibility running through all of it. Someone cared. Someone was in the room, making sure it all felt like one thing. The show was sharp enough in those early seasons to be nominated for awards, and sharp enough with its humor to draw real controversy. The Parents Television Council placed Family Guy on their list of worst primetime programs in the year 2000. The Federal Communications Commission received complaints about it. For a new animated comedy on Fox, generating that kind of real-world reaction was proof that it was actually doing something. It was not just background noise, it was landing. Season 1 averaged 12.8 million households in the Nielsen ratings, placing it at number 33 overall for that broadcast year. For a brand new animated show, that was genuinely impressive. It suggested that Family Guy had secured a real audience, not just curious browsers, but people who had decided to make it a weekly habit. And then Fox, being Fox, set about making that as difficult as possible. Before we move on, drop a comment below and let me know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're watching from. And if you're enjoying this so far, hitting subscribe means a lot. It genuinely helps keep this channel going. Part 2. The Cancellation, the Cult, and the Comeback. The story of Family Guy's first death is a story about a network doing everything it could to sabotage a show it had greenlit and then seemed not to fully understand what to do with. During Season 2, Fox moved Family Guy to Thursday nights at 9 p.m. This placed it in direct competition with Frasier on NBC, which at the time was one of the most dominant comedies on television. Frasier was deep into its run, beloved by critics, and pulling in large, stable audiences every week. Putting a new animated comedy about a dysfunctional family from Rhode Island up against a long-established prestige sitcom was not a scheduling decision made from a place of confidence. It was the kind of thing networks do when they are not sure what they have and are hoping someone else will tell them. The ratings dropped. Fox moved the show again, this time to Tuesday nights, where it landed opposite Who Wants to Be a Millionaire on ABC. That show was, in the years around 2000, a phenomenon. Regis Philbin, sitting across from people who might win $1 million, was drawing audiences that dwarfed what most scripted shows could manage. Family Guy got beat badly. Fox shuffled the schedule again. Then again, the audience had no stable night to tune into, and viewership suffered for it in exactly the predictable way. By the end of season 3 in 2002, Fox made it official. Family Guy was canceled. The show was done. This is not an unusual outcome for a program that had been treated the way Family Guy was treated by its own network. Constant schedule shuffling, no stable home, weak promotion, these are the conditions under which plenty of good shows have quietly disappeared. And at the time, most observers assumed that was the end of it. Fox had canceled the show twice, as it turned out, since there had been an earlier pickup situation during those early seasons, and almost nothing ever comes back from a double cancellation. What happened next is one of the most remarkable stories in the history of American television. Cartoon Network, specifically its late-night programming block called Adult Swim, acquired the rights to air Family Guy reruns. They got those rights cheaply because at the time nobody particularly thought they were buying anything valuable. A canceled animated show that had been jerked around by Fox and eventually let go. The price reflected that assessment. Adult Swim premiered Family Guy reruns on the 20th of April 2003. Almost overnight, something unexpected happened. The show became the highest-rated program on the entire block. It was not just popular, it was dominant. Family Guy drove Adult Swim's late-night viewership up by an extraordinary 239%. The numbers were not subtle. They were not a marginal improvement. They were a transformation. At the same time, the DVD releases for seasons 1 and 2 went on sale. Those disc sets moved over 400,000 copies, which was a remarkable sales figure for a canceled cartoon that was no longer in production. People were not just watching the reruns on cable. They were buying the show outright, keeping physical copies of it, recommending it to friends, treating it like something worth owning. A cult following had formed during the show's original run, and it had apparently been building quietly while the show was off the air. The Adult Swim success and the DVD numbers made that following visible in a way that could not be ignored. Family Guy, a dead show, was generating real money and real engagement. Fox noticed. In 2004, Fox ordered new episodes. A 4th season was officially in production. Family Guy was coming back. This announcement landed in television circles with the weight of genuine news because the thing that had happened, a twice-canceled show being revived based on the strength of reruns and physical media sales, was not supposed to happen. It did not happen. Not in the television industry of 2004. Shows got canceled and stayed canceled. The machinery did not run backwards. Fan reaction was enormous. People who had been watching their DVD copies and tuning into Adult Swim at midnight felt vindicated. The show they had discovered, or refused to let go of, was being given a second life. The 4th season was set to premiere in 2005, and Fox was treating the return as a significant event, placing Family Guy right in the middle of what they were calling their animation domination lineup on Sunday nights. The Simpsons, King of the Hill, American Dad, a brand new McFarlane creation, also premiering that year, and Family Guy, all on the same night, all for the same audience. The hype was real and the stakes were high. Fox had bet meaningfully on this comeback, and the fan base that had lobbied for it with their viewing habits and their wallets was eager to see what the show would do with its second chance. But here's where the story starts to get complicated. McFarlane himself, in interviews over the years, acknowledged something important about the 3-year gap between the cancellation and the revival. When a show goes off the air, the writers move on. They have no choice. A television writing staff cannot sit in suspended animation waiting for a show that may never return. They find new jobs, they develop new projects, they get absorbed into the machinery of other productions. The tight, specific, collectively attuned group of writers who had built the tone and sensibility of those first 3 seasons scattered during the years Family Guy was off the air. When the show came back in 2005, it was not the same writing room. Some of the original team returned, many did not. New writers came in, talented people, but people who brought different sensibilities and different instincts. And McFarlane, while absolutely still involved with the show, was also dealing with the expanded demands of now being the showrunner for 2 animated series simultaneously, Family Guy and American Dad, both premiering the same year. The show that came back in 2005 was Family Guy. It had the same characters, the same world, the same basic setup, but something subtle had shifted. The specific chemistry of those original 3 seasons, the precise calibration of heart against humor, of sharp writing against genuine warmth, had been disrupted. Not shattered, not destroyed, but altered in ways that you could feel if you had spent enough time with the original episodes. The animation changed visibly. The first 3 seasons had a rougher, more hand-drawn quality, a certain loose and expressive energy that suited the comedy. Different studios had handled different seasons, with Rough Draft Studios doing seasons 2 and 3 and giving those episodes a lively, kinetic feel that fans particularly responded to. When season 4 arrived, the animation was cleaner and in some technical sense more polished, but it also felt stiffer, more constrained. The characters moved differently. The show looked like a more expensive version of itself but felt slightly less alive. None of this was fatal. Season 4 was a success. Audiences showed up. The hype had driven real viewership numbers, and the show was a hit again, at least for the moment. And there were genuinely excellent episodes in Season 4 moments that felt like pure distillations of what made Family Guy great. But the cracks were already forming, fine and easy to miss at first, like hairlines in old plaster. You had to know where to look. Part 3. The Revival and the First Shifts, Seasons 4 and 5. Season 4 premiered on the 1st of May 2005, and the air around it felt like a celebration. Fox had placed Family Guy at the center of animation domination, a packaging decision that telegraphed genuine investment. The show was not being quietly slipped back onto the schedule. It was being treated like an event. Alongside The Simpsons, which was by that point a kind of permanent institution on Sunday nights, Family Guy was being positioned as a co-anchor, a pillar of the lineup rather than a dependent on it. The first thing audiences noticed, beyond the animation shift already mentioned, was the cutaway gags. In the first 3 seasons, cutaways were a signature feature of the show, but they did not dominate it. They arrived with purpose, stayed briefly, made their point, and left. The pacing of a Season 1 or Season 2 episode had a rhythm to it: main story, quick digression, back to main story, character interaction, quick digression again, that felt natural and controlled. The cutaways enhanced the episodes without displacing them. Starting in Season 4, something about that balance shifted. The cutaways got longer, they arrived more frequently, and increasingly they began to feel less like additions to the story and more like substitutes for it. Scenes would function as setup lines designed primarily to launch a cutaway rather than as pieces of a developing plot. Characters would be standing around having conversations that existed mainly to provide an occasion for another leap to a random gag. The architecture of the show, the relationship between story and joke, was quietly reorienting around the gags at the expense of the story. Now, to be honest about this, many of those cutaways were still genuinely funny. Some of the most shared and rewatched Family Guy clips in internet history come from this era. The format of a short, self-contained, completely unexpected comedic sketch was almost perfectly calibrated for the way video sharing was beginning to work. YouTube launched in 2005, the same year Family Guy returned. A 15-second cutaway that happened to be brilliant could be clipped out and shared and accumulate millions of views completely independent of the episode it came from. Family Guy became extraordinarily viral during this period in a way that served the show's profile enormously. But virality and storytelling quality are not the same thing, and the show was beginning to drift toward optimizing for the former at the expense of the latter. Peter's character also began to shift in Season 4, though the changes were still subtle enough that many viewers either did not notice or were willing to attribute them to the slightly jarring nature of the revival. In the original 3 seasons, Peter was dumb in a specific calibrated way. He made terrible decisions because he lacked foresight and because his self-belief was perfectly impervious to evidence. But his stupidity had a floor. He was not incapable of basic human understanding or basic human feeling. He loved Lois. He loved his kids, even when he was ignoring them or accidentally injuring them. His wrong-headedness came from a place of genuine enthusiasm rather than from a place of malice. In Season 4, the floor of Peter's intelligence started to drop. Not dramatically, not all at once, but noticeably. There were moments where his behavior crossed from dumb but lovable into something that required a little more explaining away. Scenes where his self-centeredness shaded towards something colder. The show did not consistently hold him accountable for these moments the way the earlier seasons would have, where some version of consequence and reflection would arrive before the credits. Brian's character showed the first signs of what would become a very significant shift. His political views, which had always been part of who he was, liberal, openly atheist, opinionated about social issues, began to occupy more screen time. In the first 3 seasons, Brian's opinions were one color among many in a complex character portrait. He was a failed writer. He drank too much. He had unrequited feelings for Lois. He was Peter's best friend and most honest critic. His politics were just one ingredient. After the revival, the show began gradually promoting that one ingredient above the others. Scenes would pause to let Brian deliver a speech about whatever issue was on the writers' minds that week. The speeches were, in isolation, often coherent, but they accumulated. They started to feel less like a character expressing his views and more like the writers using a character as a vehicle for their own. Brian was slowly becoming a megaphone rather than a person. Stewie's transformation was more visible and in some ways more philosophically interesting to think about. The writers, including MacFarlane, had begun to feel that the evil baby concept had been thoroughly explored. After 3 seasons of world domination plots and elaborate attempts on Lois's life, they wanted to do something different with the character. Season 4 began the process of moving Stewie away from villainy and toward a more personal, emotional storyline framework. The attempts to kill Lois became less frequent. The big scheme episodes gave way to episodes about Stewie's inner life, his friendship with Brian, his identity. Some of this worked. The deepening friendship between Stewie and Brian became one of the most popular elements of the show during this period, and their dynamic as an odd couple pair, wildly mismatched in temperament and worldview, but genuinely fond of each other, produced some memorable episodes. The Road to Specials adventure episodes that sent Brian and Stewie off together to some unlikely destination were reliably entertaining and often cited as highlights of the post-revival years. But the trade-off was real. Stewie was, in those first 3 seasons, genuinely one of a kind. There was no other character like him anywhere on television. The evil genius baby was not just funny. He was strange in a productive way. Strange in a way that gave the show one of its most distinctive textures. As that strangeness was softened, as Stewie became safer and warmer and more relatable, the show lost something that it could not easily replace. Season 5, which ran from 2006 into 2007, continued and deepened all of these trends. The cutaways kept expanding. Peter kept edging towards something more aggressive. Brian's soapboxing grew more pronounced. Stewie's softer side took more screen time, and a new, troubling pattern emerged around Meg. In seasons 1 through 3, Meg's role was comic in a gentle, relatable way. She was the least exceptional member of an extremely exceptional family. She was not ugly or contemptible or deserving of punishment. She was just ordinary, and the show used that ordinariness as a contrast against the extraordinary weirdness surrounding her. The joke about Meg was that she was the normal one, which made her stand out. Starting in season 4 and escalating through season 5, the joke about Meg changed. It stopped being about her ordinariness and started being about her undesirability. Characters began openly commenting on her appearance in cruel terms. Peter's occasional insensitivity sharpened into something that felt more deliberate. The family's treatment of Meg shifted from benign neglect to active contempt. The seeds were being planted for what would become, in later seasons, one of the most sustained and uncomfortable running jokes in the history of animated television. Despite all of this, despite the cutaway creep, the character shifts, the tonal drift, seasons 4 and 5 are still considered, by most fans who have been with the show from the beginning, to be reasonably good television. They are not seasons 1 through 3. The specific magic of those original years, the precise balance of intelligence and heart and sharp writing, was already somewhat disrupted. But the show was still operating at a level that produced genuinely excellent episodes alongside its weaker ones, and the voice performances were as strong as they had ever been. MacFarlane, Alex Borstein, Mila Kunis, Seth Green, and the rest of the cast were performing at a high level. The talent in the recording booth had not changed. The problem was not who was speaking the words. The problem was slowly becoming the words themselves. Part 4. The Tipping Point, Seasons 6 and 7. If Seasons 4 and 5 were the period during which you could sense something changing but could not quite put your finger on what, Seasons 6 and 7 are where the change stopped being subtle. These 2 seasons form a kind of bridge in the show's history, connecting the version that most fans still broadly liked to the version that most fans remember as the beginning of a real and lasting decline. Individually, these seasons still contain excellent episodes. Collectively, they mark the point at which the problems became structural, rather than isolated. Season 6 premiered on the 23rd of September 2007, and the animation shift had continued. The studio handling production at this point was Digital Emation, and their work gave the show a noticeably flatter, more rigid appearance. The outlines on the characters were heavier. The movement was more constrained. Where the early seasons had a kind of organic looseness to their visual language, characters moved in ways that felt expressive and slightly unpredictable. The Season 6 animation felt more mechanical. Another studio, Yadim, was also involved during this stretch, producing episodes with digitally drawn visuals that were technically clean but tonally cold. Animation quality is easy to dismiss as a secondary concern when discussing why a comedy show fails, but comedy lives in the details of timing and expression, and the details of how a character's face moves when delivering a joke or reacting to one. The visual energy of the early seasons was part of what made those episodes feel alive. The stiffer, more corporate-looking animation of Seasons 6 and 7 was part of why they felt less so. Season 6 did produce what many fans consider to be among the last truly ambitious storytelling the show ever attempted. The two-part episode Stewie Kills Lois and Lois Kills Stewie was a callback to the original promise of the character, a full commitment to actually following through on the premise that had animated Stewie from the beginning. In the first part, Stewie finally kills Lois. In the second part, Lois turns out to be alive, returns, and a full-scale confrontation erupts. The episodes were dramatic and darkly funny and delivered on years of built-up anticipation. Fans responded enormously. Critics praised them. They are still frequently cited as among the best Family Guy episodes ever made. And then the show undercut all of it. The two-parter ended with a reveal that the entire story had been a simulation running on Stewie's computer. None of it happened. No consequences. No change. Everything reset to the position it had been in before the first episode of the two-parter began. The show had the technical right to pull that move. Animated comedies that run in episodic format without serialized continuity use reset endings all the time. The Simpsons had been doing it for years. But there is a difference between a show that uses the reset as part of its established grammar and a show that deploys it specifically to avoid the consequences of a story it had been building toward for 3 seasons. The Stewie Kills Lois two-parter felt, to many viewers, less like a bold creative choice and more like the show demonstrating that it was no longer willing to let anything actually matter. This was a symptom of a larger issue that would only worsen. Family Guy was becoming a show that could execute the gestures of consequence, the big moments, the dramatic turns, the episodes that felt like they were changing something without ever actually committing to what those changes would mean. It had discovered that it could generate the emotional charge of a real story development and then simply take it back, collecting the engagement without paying the price of genuinely altered circumstances. November 2007 brought a crisis that had nothing to do with Family Guy's internal creative problems, but nevertheless hit the show hard. The Writers Guild of America went on strike. This was a massive labor action involving thousands of television and film writers who were fighting for better pay, specifically around compensation for DVD sales and the newly relevant territory of digital distribution. The strike ran from the 5th of November, 2007 to the 12th of February, 2008, roughly 100 days. MacFarlane was a vocal and visible supporter of the writers during this period. He joined the picket lines. He made public statements supporting the Guild's positions. His commitment to the striking writers was genuine and consistent. But Fox, during the strike, made a decision that MacFarlane found deeply objectionable. The network elected to air 3 Family Guy episodes that had been completed before the strike began. These were episodes Fox technically had the right to broadcast. They were finished product, paid for, and delivered. MacFarlane had not wanted them aired during the strike, viewing it as a kind of strike-breaking adjacency, a way of keeping the show on television while the people who created television's content were on the picket line. Fox aired them anyway. This was an early and clear crystallization of a tension between MacFarlane and Fox that had been building since the original cancellations and would continue to build for years afterward. The network that had canceled his show twice, shuffled it repeatedly, and now aired episodes against his wishes during a labor action was not, from MacFarlane's perspective, a reliable creative partner. The relationship between creator and network was functional but cold, transactional in ways that were beginning to show. The strike ended in February 2008 and production resumed. But the disruption had done real damage to the show's creative rhythm. Television writers work on tightly coordinated schedules. They break stories months in advance, layer seasonal arcs, build towards specific episodes. A 3-month full stop in the middle of that process does not leave the machinery precisely where it was. You cannot simply pick up the needle and drop it back exactly where it left off. The rhythm gets broken. Writers lose the thread of stories they were building. The accumulated momentum of a season in progress dissipates. Season 7, running from 2008 into 2009, showed the effects of all of this. The humor had shifted noticeably in its relationship to shock value. In the early seasons, the show's darker jokes worked because they were smart. The darkness was in service of something. A punchline, a satirical point, a moment of genuine comedic surprise. The offense was a delivery mechanism for wit. By season 7, more and more of the show's provocative content was existing primarily for its own sake. The darkness was the joke rather than the setup for one. It was less often trying to say something and more often simply trying to provoke a reaction. Peter's behavior grew more volatile and less accountable. Episodes could have him behaving with genuine warmth in one scene and genuinely cruel indifference in the next, with no particular consistency connecting the two. Brian's political views occupied more screen time and more explicitly positioned him as a vessel for the writer's opinions, rather than as a character with beliefs that felt organic to who he was. One episode from Season 7, called 420, centered on Brian leading a campaign to legalize marijuana in the show's fictional setting of Stoolbend Wait. The Griffins live in Quahog, the show's home city. The episode generated real-world controversy when the Venezuelan government objected to its content and banned Family Guy from airing on domestic cable networks, with the country's justice minister citing the episode as American propaganda promoting drug use. Cable stations were warned they could face fines. Whatever your personal view of the episode's content, the fact that an animated comedy on Fox was generating international diplomatic incidents suggested that the show's relationship with its own boundaries had become genuinely difficult to read, even for the people making it. Season 7 also introduced what would become one of the most frequently cited signs of creative exhaustion in the show's later years: the tendency to stretch jokes past the point of humor and into the territory of endurance. In the early seasons, a physical gag or a running bit that had made its point would end quickly. The show moved at the rhythm of confidence, the rhythm of writers who knew when something was done and did not feel the need to wring more out of it. By season 7, this discipline was eroding. Gags would continue past the laugh point, past the second laugh point, into a third and fourth repetition that produced diminishing returns at best and active annoyance at worst. A joke that should have lasted 5 seconds would go 30. A scene that could have made its point in 10 seconds would run for a full minute. The show was beginning to fill its running time with the prolongation of existing material rather than the creation of new material, and audiences who had been paying attention could feel the difference, even if they could not always articulate it. Despite all of this, Seasons 6 and 7 were not disasters. They were inconsistent, which is different from being uniformly bad. For every episode that felt tired or mean-spirited, there was another that showed genuine flashes of the old sharpness. The road trip episodes featuring Brian and Stewie remained reliably entertaining. Individual performances and individual moments were as strong as anything in the show's history. The cast was doing excellent work. The problem was what they were being asked to say and do, and that problem was worsening season by season. Part 5. The Flanderization of Peter Griffin. There is a word that has made its way from animated television criticism into the broader language of how we talk about long-running characters, and that word is Flanderization. It comes from Ned Flanders, the neighborly, devoutly religious man who lived next to Homer Simpson in Springfield. In the early seasons of The Simpsons, Ned was a fully rounded character. He was kind, patient, a good father, someone whose faith was one dimension among many. Over time, as the show aged and the writers found it easier to deploy him as a quick type rather than a full person, his religion expanded to consume everything else. Every other quality he had been given receded until what remained was essentially a cartoon of one trait. Flanderization is what happens when the complexity of a character gets reduced to a single exaggerated trait repeated endlessly, when the writers stop asking who this person is and start asking only what button to push to get their assigned reaction. Family Guy might be the single most extreme example of this process in the history of American animation, and no character on the show suffered it more completely than Peter Griffin himself. To understand how far Peter fell, you need to hold the original version of him in your mind clearly. In seasons 1 through 3, Peter was a simple man with a specific texture. He worked at the Happy-Go-Lucky toy factory before eventually moving to the Pawtucket Patriot Brewery. He loved beer, loved his friends at the Drunken Clam, loved television, particularly anything from the 1970s and 1980s. He was overweight and not especially bright. He made bad decisions with great confidence and terrible judgment. These were his defining qualities. But here is the thing that got lost as the seasons accumulated. Underneath all of that, underneath the stupidity and the bad decisions and the beer and the chaos, Peter loved his family. He loved Lois. He loved his children. When he messed up, and he messed up constantly, he felt it. He would realize by the end of an episode that he had done something wrong or hurtful, and he would try to fix it. Not always successfully and not always gracefully, but genuinely. He apologized. He admitted fault. He would stand in the living room with his face doing that particular thing it did when Peter Griffin was ashamed of himself and tell Lois that he was sorry and he loved her. Those moments landed because they were earned. The show had made you watch Peter create the mess, and now it was making you watch him try to clean it up, and the cleaning up felt like something. The distance between that Peter and the Peter who arrives around season 8 and beyond is enormous. Not because the character became stupider, though that happened too, but because he became meaner. The lovable fool who felt bad about causing harm turned into something more like a person who enjoyed causing harm, or at minimum, could not be bothered to care either way. The examples are scattered throughout the later seasons in ways that become almost impossible to process once you start listing them. There is an episode in which Peter and Lois are on a boat together, and Peter spots what he thinks is a shark fin in the water. His immediate, unthinking response is to shove Lois underwater and flee the boat. He leaves his wife, the woman he has supposedly loved for decades, to what he genuinely believes is a shark attack while he escapes alone. It turned out to be a dolphin. That does not change what Peter did. The original version of Peter, the one who stumbled through disasters but whose heart was always ultimately in the right place, could not have done that. That Peter, however impulsively and clumsily, would have tried to protect his wife even if his attempt was doomed and ridiculous. The later Peter does not hesitate. He calculates, in the split second available to him, that he would prefer to survive even at the cost of Lois's life, and he acts on that calculation. In another episode, Peter steals Halloween candy from Stewie, his own baby, and the episode offhandedly mentions that he used to do the same thing to Chris when Chris was younger. This is a grown man, a father taking candy from his infant child because he wants it, not because he is confused or overwhelmed or making a bad decision in a complicated situation. Because he wants the candy and the baby has it. In an episode involving Joe Swanson, Peter's friend and neighbor, Peter becomes instrumental in nearly destroying Joe's marriage by convincing Joe to pursue another woman. Joe is supposed to be one of Peter's closest friends. In the original seasons, Peter gave bad advice because he was too dim to understand the consequences, but he did not deliberately try to wreck the lives of the people he loved. The later Peter has no such boundary. There is an episode called Petergeist, actually many episodes, but the pattern repeats. Peter does something to hurt someone close to him, faces no meaningful accountability, and the episode ends without him having learned anything that carries forward into the next episode. The lack of consequence is not an isolated creative choice. It is a structural feature of how the character is written in the later seasons. Peter can do terrible things because the writers have removed the mechanism that would make those terrible things matter. The physical violence involving Peter also escalated in ways that crossed from cartoon slapstick into something genuinely uncomfortable. Cartoon violence has been a feature of animation since animation existed. Characters getting hurt in exaggerated ways and bouncing back is part of the grammar of the medium. Nobody watching Tom chase Jerry or Wile-E. Coyote fall off a cliff experiences genuine distress because the visual language of cartoon physics communicates that none of it is real in any way that should concern you. But the violence in Family Guy's later seasons moved beyond that grammar into something more specific and more unpleasant. Injuries were depicted with realistic detail. Characters were shown with genuine physical damage, exposed brains, dangling eyes, severe wounds drawn with a care for accuracy that the exaggerated cartoon physics of earlier seasons never required. Peter was frequently at the center of these scenes, either as perpetrator or victim, and the show's framing communicated that the audience was supposed to find the realistic gore funny. Some viewers did. Many found it jarring in a way that was hard to name but had something to do with the mismatch between the cartoon setting and the increasingly realistic treatment of physical harm. The Season 10 episode Seahorse Seashell Party contains what might be the single most illuminating moment in the entire show's relationship with what Peter had become. In this episode, Meg, having endured years of accumulated abuse and contempt, finally confronts her family directly. She turns to Peter and delivers a speech that is, in its way, a clinical accounting of his character. She calls him completely selfish. She calls him totally irresponsible as a father. She lists specific things he has done, things the audience has watched him do across multiple seasons, and she names them for what they are. The speech is specific, accurate, and unflinching. And Peter laughs. He does not feel shame. He does not feel guilt or sadness or the particular discomfort of being accurately seen. He finds it amusing. His daughter is telling him, with genuine pain, that his behavior has made her life worse, and he is entertained by the performance of her distress. Early Peter would have been hurt by that speech. He might not have understood all of it. He might have deflected some of it with characteristic obliviousness. But something in him would have responded to the emotional reality of what was being said, because early Peter had emotional reality. He had the capacity to feel the weight of causing harm, even if his understanding of how he had caused it was incomplete. The later Peter has had that capacity surgically removed by a decade of writing choices that gradually privileged his outrageousness over his humanity, until what remained was a character who functioned more as a chaos delivery system than as a person. Peter's friendships degraded in parallel. The dynamic between Peter, Joe, Quagmire, and Cleveland in those first 3 seasons was one of the show's warmest elements. 4 friends who genuinely liked each other, who had each other's backs even in the middle of Peter's disasters, who represented the specific texture of a particular kind of male friendship, not exceptionally articulate about its own affections but unmistakably real. That friendship became progressively hollowed out in the later seasons. Peter would do awful things to these men with no consequence. The warmth that had characterized the early bar scenes at the Drunken Clam was replaced by a colder dynamic in which the friends were more likely to be used as targets for Peter's aggression or incompetence than as genuine companions. Joe Swanson's arc within the show is a particularly pointed illustration of this. When Joe was introduced in the very first season, in an episode called A Hero Sits Next Door, he was presented as the coolest man in the neighborhood. He was a wheelchair-using police officer, tough and capable and admired by everyone around him. Peter was jealous of how much people liked Joe. The setup was that Joe's disability did not define him, his competence and his character did. Over the years, Joe's disability became the joke. It became a punchline in scenes involving the people who were supposed to be his friends. His wife fell out of love with him. His friends mocked him in ways that had nothing to do with the generous ribbing of genuine friendship and everything to do with a writing room that had run out of ideas for how to use him meaningfully. Peter, who had once been envious of Joe's standing, became one of the primary vectors through which Joe was diminished. The man who had been jealous of his friend's success became the man who participated in kicking that friend while he was down. When the central character of a show becomes someone the audience does not want to spend time with, the damage radiates outward. It becomes hard to root for a family whose father is a monster. It becomes hard to enjoy the jokes when the jokes are coming from a place of genuine cruelty rather than from the exaggerated but fundamentally warm-hearted place they came from in the early years. The Peter Griffin of the later seasons is not funny in the way early Peter was funny. Early Peter made you laugh because you recognized in him something human and familiar, even at his most absurd. Later Peter makes you uncomfortable because the recognition is gone. He is not a person. He is a type. A type reduced to a single note, played as loudly and as frequently as possible, with no awareness of how it sounds to the people around him. Part 6. Brian Griffin. From voice of reason to the most disliked dog on television. If Peter Griffin's decline was a story of cruelty replacing warmth, Brian Griffin's decline was something more subtle and in some ways more genuinely painful to watch, because Brian started in a different position. Brian was the character the audience was supposed to identify with. He was not the everyman buffoon or the evil genius or the ignored teenager. He was the one who saw clearly. He was the one who reacted the way you or I would react when placed in the middle of the Griffin family's particular brand of chaos. When Brian was introduced, he was a talking dog who happened to be the most intelligent and most emotionally grounded member of a household full of chaos. He walked upright. He drank martinis. He drove a car. He wrote or tried to write literary fiction. The joke was never really that he was a dog. The joke was that he was the normal one. And he happened to be a dog. And everyone just kind of went with it. Brian had genuine complexity. He was a failed writer, working on a novel for years that he could never quite finish. He drank a little too much, which was played not for comedy so much as for a quiet, recognizable kind of sadness. A smart person who had not quite become what he had hoped to become, using alcohol to soften the edges of that awareness. He had unrequited feelings for Lois, which he kept largely buried but which would surface occasionally in ways that were more touching than troubling, more about longing than about predation. He was unlucky in love, perpetually falling for women who were wrong for him or who did not feel the same way, and that unluckiness felt earned by the specific combination of his intelligence and his self-deception. He was Peter's best friend, which was the show's central comic relationship. Brian would say the sensible thing. Peter would not listen. Things would go wrong. Brian would be there to witness the wreckage and say something dry and accurate about how it had come to this. They needed each other in the way that very different people sometimes need each other. Peter grounding Brian in something immediate and uncomplicated, Brian giving Peter access to a perspective on the world that he could never have arrived at on his own. The first major shift in Brian's character came after the revival. His political views, always a background element, began to occupy the foreground. Entire scenes were written as occasions for Brian to deliver speeches about social and political issues. The speeches themselves were not always wrong. They often represented genuinely held and articulable positions, but the way they were inserted into the show stopped feeling like a character expressing himself and started feeling like something else. The writers were using Brian as a channel. He was becoming less a person with political views and more a political view wearing a dog suit. Even viewers who agreed with Brian's positions found this annoying. That is the tell. When people who share your beliefs tell you that your advocacy is grating, the issue is not the content of what is being said. The issue is the way it is being said, and the relationship between the person saying it and the audience receiving it. Brian was no longer in dialogue with the world around him. He was pronouncing at it. And pronouncement, regardless of its accuracy, is fundamentally less interesting than genuine exchange. But the political soapboxing was only the most visible manifestation of a deeper problem. Brian's character, underneath the speeches, was undergoing a personality transformation that the show did not seem to be tracking consciously. The genuine intelligence of early Brian, the intelligence that had been real, that showed up in the specificity of his observations and the genuine warmth of his friendships, was being replaced by a kind of performed intelligence, an insistence on intellectualism that had become increasingly detached from any actual intellectual rigor. Early Brian had read the books he talked about. You believed this. The things he said reflected genuine engagement with ideas. Later, Brian talked about books and philosophy and culture in ways that felt like someone who had read the back covers of books and attended a few conversations about important things without actually sitting down with the difficult parts. He was performing smartness rather than being smart, and the gap between the performance and the reality widened season by season until it became an almost defining characteristic. The episode most frequently cited by fans as the moment Brian became truly difficult to watch is Brian Writes a Bestseller from Season 9. In it, Stewie, who by this point had become Brian's closest friend and most consistent supporter, encourages Brian to return to writing after a long period of discouragement. Brian takes that encouragement and produces a self-help book called Wish It, Want It, Do It. The book becomes a massive commercial success, and Brian's response to this success is to transform, almost instantly, into one of the most unpleasant people on the show. He becomes arrogant beyond any proportion. He treats Stewie, the one who believed in him, the one who pushed him back toward the writing, with contempt. He belittles him. He dismisses him. He acts as though Stewie is beneath his notice. The episode shows Brian at his most ungrateful and his most dishonest, because the success he is celebrating is based on a book that required far less of him than the serious literary fiction he had been trying and failing to produce for years. He has succeeded at something lesser than what he claimed to want, and instead of grappling honestly with what that means, he has simply grabbed the success and used it to feel superior to everyone around him. The list of genuinely troubling things Brian does in later seasons is long and worth sitting with for a moment, not to be gratuitously negative, but because the accumulation is the point. He inadvertently infects both Chris and Stewie with herpes, and responds to this with a casualness that is hard to reconcile with the Brian of the early seasons, the one who genuinely cared about the people around him. He destroys Stewie's beloved stuffed bear Rupert by chewing it to pieces while drunk, apparently because he found Stewie's attachment to the toy annoying. In one episode, he discovers a woman trapped in a car that is about to fall into water. He begins to rescue her. He finds out she is a mother and is therefore, presumably, married, and he lets the car go. He allows a woman and her child to drown because she is not available for him to date. That last example is worth pausing on. The show presents it as a dark joke. The framing is comedic. But what is actually happening is that a character who began his existence as the show's moral compass is committing a double murder, allowing two people to die because of romantic availability. The journey from the voice of reason to allows innocent people to drown for personal convenience is not a subtle or defensible character arc. It is a long, ugly fall, written by people who either did not notice how far they had taken him or did not particularly care. The relationship between Brian and Quagmire became, during this period, one of the most talked about dynamics on the show. In an episode called Jerome is the New Black from Season 8, Quagmire delivers a monologue directed at Brian that has become one of the most frequently referenced pieces of dialogue in the show's post-revival history. He itemizes Brian's failings with brutal specificity: the failed writing career, the pretension toward an intellectualism Brian has not earned, the ongoing pursuit of Lois right in front of her husband and his best friend, the abandonment of a biological son, the self-righteousness that coexists with genuine moral failure at every level. Everything Quagmire says is accurate. None of it is exaggeration. Every point he makes is supported by things the show has actually depicted. And the interesting thing is that the speech clearly represents the writers acknowledging, through Quagmire, that they know Brian has become insufferable. They know the audience has noticed. They are putting the audience's frustrations into the mouth of a character and letting that character say them. But the speech changed nothing. Brian continued exactly as he had been. If anything, the episodes following it showed him becoming more aggressive in his pettiness toward Quagmire rather than genuinely reckoning with the critique. The show had found a way to acknowledge its problem without doing anything about it, which is a specific kind of self-awareness that is worse than no self-awareness at all, because it means the problems are visible to the people in the room and the choice is being made to continue with them anyway. Then came Season 12 and an episode called Life of Brian. Brian is hit by a car and dies. The show treats it seriously. The Griffins grieve him. Stewie is devastated. A new dog named Vinny is introduced as a replacement. Fans reacted in ways that ranged from genuine sorrow to outrage. The death made national news. It trended on social media for days. Whatever you thought of Brian's later characterization, the loss of a character who had been with the show since its premiere episode was significant. 2 episodes later, in the Christmas episode, Stewie uses time travel to save Brian from the car before it hits him. Brian comes back to life. Everything returns to normal. The whole arc, the death, the grief, the replacement dog, the family's adjustment was erased in the space of 2 broadcast weeks. The reaction to this was heavily negative, and not just from people who had missed Brian. The criticism was about what the stunt revealed about the show's relationship to its own storytelling. It had killed off a major character, not because the story demanded it, not because the character's arc had reached a natural conclusion, but because the stunt would generate viewership for a few episodes. And when it had extracted that value, it undid the death and returned to the status quo, demonstrating with complete clarity that nothing that happened on the show had any lasting meaning. After Brian's return, the show settled back into the established patterns, and Brian himself continued along the trajectory his character had been on. The moments of warmth between him and Stewie were still present. There were episodes where Brian behaved the way the early Brian would have behaved, with genuine care and self-awareness, and those episodes were reminders that the writers still knew who Brian was supposed to be. They just could not seem to stay committed to that version of him for any sustained period. Part 7. Stewie loses his edge. Every great television show has that one character who makes it genuinely irreplaceable. The character whose specific combination of qualities is so singular, so precisely itself, that you cannot imagine finding them anywhere else. For the first 3 seasons of Family Guy, that character was Stewie Griffin. Not Brian, who was a great character but a type that existed elsewhere. The sardonic intellectual with a drinking problem and frustrated artistic ambitions could be found in other places. Not Peter, who was the latest in a long line of lovable television idiots. Not even Lois, who was well-written but occupied a recognizable archetype. Stewie was something that had not existed before. a 1-year-old British accented criminal mastermind with a genuine obsession with world domination and a very specific desire to murder his mother between feedings. The comedy of early Stewie operated at two simultaneous frequencies. On one level, it was pure absurdist contrast. The tiny baby in the yellow shirt constructing doomsday devices, while someone outside the room was trying to figure out whether to give him the pacifier with the green handle or the blue handle. On another level, there was something genuinely unnerving about Stewie, something that made his scenes carry a slight electrical charge. He was unpredictable. You never quite knew what he was going to do or say. And in the world of the show, where most characters behaved in established and expected ways, Stewie's unknowability was electrifying. His obsession with killing Lois was not just a running gag. It was a sustained piece of dramatic irony. Lois, who loved Stewie with the uncomplicated warmth of a mother who sees only a baby, had no idea that the child in her arms was fantasizing about her destruction in elaborate and specific ways. The gap between her perception and reality was the source of a particular comedy that required no punchline, only the ongoing maintenance of that gap. Every interaction between them was funny because of what Lois did not know, and the audience knew everything. The other characters could not, for the most part, understand Stewie at all. His elaborate speeches registered as baby babbling to almost everyone in the household. Brian was one of the few characters who could actually comprehend what Stewie was saying and engage with him on his own terms, which is partly why their friendship became so central to both characters' subsequent development. The process of dismantling early Stewie began gently. During Season 2, the show started inserting small moments of a softer, more vulnerable Stewie alongside the villainy. Quick jokes about his appearance, moments of insecurity about his identity, glimpses of a personality that was more complicated than pure malevolence. These were minor additions at first, small texture added to a character who was already interesting, and they did not undermine what he was. By Season 3, the balance had shifted slightly. The evil genius was still present, but the episodes were finding more space for the more personal, emotionally available version of Stewie. The world domination plots were still a regular feature. The attempts on Lois's life still happened, but they did not dominate his screen time the way they had in Season 1. The revival in Season 4 accelerated the transformation into something more decisive. MacFarlane and the writers had arrived at a conclusion. The evil baby joke had run its course. They had taken it, they believed, as far as it could go. 3 seasons of world domination plots and Lois murder attempts felt, from their perspective, like sufficient exploration of the concept. To continue would be to repeat. So they moved. Season 4 began the formal transition away from evil Stewie and toward what you might call emotional Stewie, a character less defined by his schemes and more defined by his feelings, his friendship with Brian, his insecurities, his attempts to understand his own identity in a world that expected him to just be a baby. The Brian and Stewie dynamic that emerged from this transition was genuinely one of the show's most entertaining elements during the middle seasons. Their friendship had a specific texture, 2 characters who had no obvious reason to get along, one a world-weary dog with literary pretensions, and one a technically brilliant toddler with a formerly homicidal agenda, spending time together because they had quietly become indispensable to each other. The Road to specials that sent them on adventure together were reliably among the best episodes of any season they appeared in, and their chemistry was real. But the trade-off was significant in ways that became clearer as the years passed. Season 6 gave evil Stewie one last major showcase in the Stewie Kills Lois and Lois Kills Stewie 2-parter discussed earlier. The villainous genius was given his moment, the big plans finally executed, the domination of the world briefly achieved, and then everything was reset by the simulation reveal. In retrospect, those episodes feel less like an exploration of Stewie and more like a formal farewell to a version of the character the show was no longer interested in maintaining. After those episodes, the world domination plots essentially stopped. The attempts on Lois's life faded to occasional references, Easter eggs for longtime viewers rather than central story elements. The time machine, which had been a weapon of conquest, became more often a device for Brian and Stewie adventures. By seasons 8, 9, 10, and beyond, the Stewie appearing on screen was substantially a different character wearing the original's clothes. He was emotional, he was vulnerable. He was frequently the most sympathetically written character in episodes that explored his feelings about his relationships, his identity, his place in a world that kept treating him like an ordinary infant. His friendship with Brian was warm, and occasionally genuinely moving. The episode in Season 12 where Stewie goes back in time specifically to save Brian from being killed, at personal cost, is genuinely touching because of what it says about how much these two characters had come to mean to each other. The show's increasingly direct engagement with Stewie's gender identity and sexuality also shifted his characterization significantly. From around Season 4 onward, the show incorporated more explicit humor and storylines around Stewie's attraction to men, his cross-dressing, his exploration of his own femininity. Whether these storylines were handled well is a matter of ongoing debate. Some viewers felt they gave Stewie dimension and made him more fully himself. Others felt the jokes too often relied on the sexuality itself as the punchline in ways that the show did not apply to its straight characters. Whatever your view on the quality of the execution, the fact of the shift is undeniable. Stewie's identity as an evil genius became secondary to his identity as someone working out who he was in ways that were more personal and more emotionally driven. The character who had been defined by his relationship to power, who wanted to hold dominion over the world, who saw every interaction as a potential leverage point, who built weapons because the act of building things of destructive power was itself satisfying, became instead a character defined by his relationships and his feelings. The argument that this is growth rather than loss has a real foundation. A character who can only be one thing is limited. The capacity for Stewie to surprise you, to go in unexpected directions, to feel something rather than just scheme, is genuinely a form of expansion. The friendship with Brian gave the show some of its most emotionally resonant material. The exploration of Stewie's interior life produced episodes that the single-note evil genius version of the character could never have supported. But the counter-argument is equally genuine. There was only one evil genius baby in the history of animated television. The rest of what Stewie became the insecure kid working out his identity, the loyal friend, the clever adventure companion, those things can be found in many places. The original Stewie could not be found anywhere else. The writers chose to retire something irreplaceable in favor of something better available in other forms, and the show has been a slightly smaller universe for that choice ever since. Part 8. Meg Griffin and a Decade of Sustained Cruelty. Every long-running group comedy has a punching bag character, the person in the ensemble who absorbs more than their share of mockery from the people around them. The format requires it in some sense, because if everyone is equally untouchable, then the comedy has nowhere to go. But the difference between a well-handled punching bag character and a poorly handled one is enormous, and the difference lies entirely in intention and degree. Meg Griffin started as a well-handled version of the concept. In seasons 1 through 3, she was the ordinary one. Her family was extraordinary. Her father was a walking catastrophe. Her mother was an inexplicable combination of grace and frustration. Her brother was a sweet-natured non-entity. Her baby sibling was a secret supervillain. And the family dog gave career advice and had opinions about modernist literature. Against that backdrop, Meg's ordinariness was the joke. She was the teenager who just wanted normal things to fit in, to be liked, to not have her homecoming plans derailed by a family emergency in a household where normal was structurally impossible. The teasing she received in those early seasons was mild and recognizably real. Peter was sometimes thoughtless toward her, as overextended fathers with big personalities and limited self-awareness tend to be. Kids at school made fun of her because she was unpopular, and teenagers are often terrible to each other. She tried things and failed. None of it was vicious. It was exaggerated for comedy but rooted in the specific, recognizable texture of being a slightly overlooked teenage girl in a family that had bigger things on its mind. The voice behind Meg changed after the first season. Lacey Chabert voiced her in Season 1, and Mila Kunis took over from Season 2 onward, a role she has occupied ever since. Kunis brought a distinctive kind of weary sincerity to the character that would matter a great deal in later seasons, when Meg was given material that required genuine emotional performance. The first major shift happened around Season 4. The jokes about Meg stopped being about her ordinariness and started being about her physical appearance. Characters began openly commenting on how unattractive they found her. They would recoil from her. They would make disgusted noises in her presence. This was a specific and meaningful change, because it moved the mockery from something the character could theoretically address. She could become more interesting, more confident, more socially adept to something she had no control over. Her body was being made the joke. Her existence in the body she was born with was being presented as objectionable. Making fun of someone for being boring is one kind of comedy. Making fun of someone for the physical reality of their existence is a cruder kind, and it requires considerably more craft to navigate without simply being mean. Family Guy's approach to Meg's appearance in those seasons was not particularly crafted, it was direct. The writers had discovered that audiences reacted to Meg being insulted, and they started going to that well with increasing frequency. The escalation across seasons 5 through 14 was not subtle. By the middle stretch of the show's run, Meg's treatment had become one of its defining features. Peter no longer merely ignored her or made thoughtless comments. He actively despised her in ways that the show invited audiences to find funny. He would fart on her face as entertainment. He would physically shove her. He would make comments about wishing she did not exist. In a flashback, it was revealed that Peter and Lois had once tried to abandon infant Meg at a fire station. This was framed as a joke. The audience was supposed to laugh at the notion of parents trying to dispose of their baby daughter before she could walk. The entire household eventually aligned around the project of making Meg's life terrible. Lois, who in the early seasons was the patient and caring counterbalance to Peter's chaos, started treating Meg with a particular kind of cold maternal contempt that was at times even more damaging to watch than Peter's open cruelty. Chris participated in the mockery. Even Stewie, who in the original seasons had almost no relationship with Meg, began casually throwing insults her way. The school environment was no better. The popular girl who served as Meg's primary rival was relentlessly cruel. Teachers mistreated her. Random people in town insulted her without provocation. The show created a world in which the abuse of Meg Griffin was a kind of ambient condition, as natural and unremarkable as the weather. It was not addressed or questioned by characters. Nobody in the show's universe ever stepped back and said, "Hang on. We are treating a teenage girl abusively for sustained periods, and this seems like something we should examine." The cruelty was just present, episode after episode, accumulating. Mila Kunis, who lived inside this dynamic as the voice of Meg, spoke publicly about the real-world effects. Peter's dismissive catchphrase directed at Meg became something that real people would say to Kunis when they encountered her in public, not to Meg, but to the actual woman who gave Meg her voice. The actress who was trying to bring humanity to a character, the show had reduced to a punchline. The fictional cruelty had metastasized into a kind of social permission structure that went beyond the show itself. The Season 10 episode Seahorse Seashell Party is the episode most commonly cited when fans talk about the Meg situation reaching its most troubling articulation. During a hurricane that traps the family indoors, Meg finally snaps. She delivers a confrontation that is raw, specific, and accurate. She tells Peter what his fatherhood has actually meant to her. She tells Lois the truth about how her mother's complicity has shaped her self-image. She names the pattern. She describes its effects. For longtime viewers, this moment felt like overdue justice. For seasons, the show had been building up this credit, this accumulated wrongdoing, and now it was going to be addressed. Meg was going to stand up for herself, and the family was going to have to reckon with what they had done. And then the episode did something that many fans found genuinely disturbing. After Meg's outburst, the family begins to fall apart. Without Meg as their shared target, Peter, Lois, Chris, and Brian turn on each other. The Griffin family dynamic, it turns out, was dependent on having a designated recipient for all their displaced frustration, cruelty, and dysfunction. Without Meg absorbing that energy, they cannot function. The episode ends with Meg voluntarily going to Brian and taking back everything she said. She accepts, consciously and explicitly, that her role in the family is to be the person everyone else treats badly. She agrees to resume being the punching bag because the family needs her in that role in order to stay intact. The message is deeply uncomfortable, and the discomfort is not the comfortable discomfort of a show that is trying to say something difficult and true. It is the discomfort of a show that has just articulated, with unusual clarity, a genuinely troubling philosophy, that victims of abuse should accept their victimhood because their suffering is structurally necessary for the stability of the systems around them. That standing up for yourself is a selfish act because it disrupts the people who are hurting you. That the correct response to a decade of cruelty is to quietly return to being cruel to. Whether the writers intended to say that is a separate question from whether that is what the episode says, and what it says is not defensible as a comedic premise. It is not dark enough to be satire. It is not self-aware enough to be commentary. It is a show that had used a character as a target for 10 seasons, deciding when that character finally got a moment to object, to make her objection the instrument of her own resubordination. To be fair to the show, and fairness requires it even here, there were always episodes scattered through the run where Meg was written as a full person. In the crossover episode with The Simpsons, she meets Lisa Simpson, and the two of them form a real friendship, and Meg discovers a talent for the saxophone. It is warm and sweet, and shows what the show could do with Meg when it wanted to. The episode Peter's Sister in Season 14 gives genuine depth to the relationship between Peter and Meg, by revealing that Peter himself was abused by his sister growing up, and that the cycle he is perpetuating has a source. Peter and Meg reconcile. It is moving. And then the following week, everything resets, and Meg is back at the bottom of the family hierarchy, and Peter is back to treating her as an inconvenience at best. The show did eventually pull back on the extreme Meg content, beginning around season 14 or 15. The addition of more women to the writing staff is frequently credited with this shift. Meg began to receive more storylines where she was competent, where she fought back, where she demonstrated resilience and capability. By season 22, the sustained abuse had largely stopped, but 10 seasons is a long time to spend making one character the vessel for everything the show found contemptible, and the damage to her characterization was done regardless of the belated corrections. Part 9. Cutaway gags from secret weapon to writing crutch. If you have watched even a single episode of Family Guy, you have encountered the cutaway. It is the show's most famous formal gesture and, in the later seasons, its most symptomatic one. A character makes a statement, "This is worse than the time or "I haven't been this surprised since," and the screen leaps to an unrelated scene, plays out a quick joke, and returns. It has been there from the very first episode in 1999. The cutaway is Family Guy. In the early seasons, cutaway gags were one of the things that made the show distinctive and exciting. They were short, they were sharp, they operated on the principle of surprise, the joy of the unexpected connection, the comedy of the lateral leap to something no one was expecting. And crucially, they were additions to a story rather than substitutes for one. An early season episode had a complete plot structure, beginning, middle, end, and the cutaways were tucked inside that structure like small gifts, extra jokes that enhanced rather than replaced the narrative experience. You could have removed every cutaway from a season 2 episode and still had a well-constructed, satisfying story. The cutaways were the bonus track, not the album. The people making the show during those years had an instinct for when a cutaway had done its job and needed to end. The best early cutaways lasted 5 to 15 seconds. They made one point, got one laugh, and vanished. The brevity was part of their power. A joke that arrives suddenly, lands cleanly, and disappears before you can fully process what happened is a more effective joke than one that arrives, lands, and then hangs around explaining itself. This instinct changed after the revival, starting with season 4 and accelerating through seasons 5, 6, 7, and beyond. The cutaways became longer, more frequent, and increasingly central to the episode structure rather than supplementary to it. Scenes were constructed primarily as setups for cutaways rather than as pieces of a developing story. The main storyline of an episode would become thinner and thinner as the proportion of running time devoted to cutaways expanded. Episodes began to feel less like stories with jokes in them, and more like collections of jokes loosely strung on the framework of a story that barely existed. A typical later season episode might have so many cutaways packed into 22 minutes that removing all of them would leave perhaps 8 to 10 minutes of actual plot. The cutaways were not supporting the story. They had become the story. And this was a structural problem, because cutaway gags are by design disconnected from the main narrative. They do not advance the plot. They do not develop character. They do not contribute to the emotional arc of whatever is happening in the Griffins' lives that week. When they take over the episode, the things they cannot do, tell a story, develop a character, generate genuine emotional investment, go undone. South Park, the Colorado-based animated comedy that has been Family Guy's most vocal creative rival, made this precise argument in a 2-part episode in 2006 called Cartoon Wars. In those episodes, Trey Parker and Matt Stone depicted Family Guy's creative process as manatees randomly pushing idea balls together. The suggestion being that the connections between jokes and the story around them were entirely arbitrary, that any cutaway could be swapped out for any other cutaway without changing anything, because none of them connected to anything meaningful. Parker and Stone were not neutral observers. They had competitive reasons to be critical. But the core observation that Family Guy's cutaways had become interchangeable in ways the early ones were not was hard to argue with, especially as the later seasons continued to prove the point. The Conway Twitty gag became the most frequently cited example of cutaway excess crossing into something actively contemptuous of the audience. Conway Twitty was a country singer, and the running bit was that instead of a joke, the show would simply cut to a full-length performance of a Conway Twitty song. Not a quick reference, not a clip. A complete, unedited performance that would run for its full duration while the audience sat there. There was no punchline, there was no twist or subversion. The joke, if it was one, was simply that the show had replaced comedy with a country song. The first time, it had the shock value of its own pointlessness. By the fourth or fifth iteration, it was widely described as one of the laziest things in the show's history. A writing staff essentially admitting, through the structure of the bit, that they did not have enough material to fill the episode and had decided that a literal music performance was an acceptable substitute. The tendency to stretch jokes horizontally also became a defining feature of the later cutaways and of the show generally. A physical gag that should have lasted 5 seconds would run for 40. A running scene in which a character repeatedly did the same thing, fell, reacted, would continue past the point of the laugh, past the point of the joke dying, into a third territory that producers seemed to believe would become funny again through sheer prolongation. Sometimes it worked. The commitment gag, where the extended length is itself part of the comedy, is a legitimate technique, but it requires a specific kind of calibration, and applied clumsily or too frequently it becomes something the audience has to endure rather than enjoy. The Season 10 episode Back to the Pilot included a moment that is simultaneously funny and a perfect inadvertent illustration of the problem. Brian and Stewie travel back in time to the first episode of the show, and while there, they observe the Griffin family standing awkwardly in silence during a cutaway, just waiting, doing nothing, for the duration of the gag. The joke is that characters have nothing to do during cutaways. They are essentially paused. It is a genuinely clever meta-observation. It is also exactly what critics had been pointing out for years. The cutaways remove the characters from the story and leave them standing around with nothing to do while random jokes happen. The show was capable, when it wanted to be, of demonstrating that it did not need cutaways to be excellent television. The Season 8 episode Brian and Stewie is one of the most frequently cited pieces of evidence for this. The entire episode takes place in a single location, a bank vault where Brian and Stewie have been accidentally locked overnight. There are no cutaways, no random gags, no disconnected sketches, just two characters talking, genuinely and sometimes painfully, about their lives, their friendship, their fears, their regrets. Brian reveals that he keeps a gun in a safety deposit box because there are times when he has thought about ending his own life. Stewie reveals how much Brian means to him. The episode is raw and emotionally honest, and completely unlike anything else in the show's later run. It was praised widely. It demonstrated conclusively that Family Guy could make excellent television without its signature comedic device. And then it returned to the established pattern, and the cutaways kept multiplying. The connection between cutaway dependency and character degradation is not accidental. When a show spends the majority of its running time on disconnected gags rather than on the characters and their relationships, the characters do not develop. The warmth that made the early Griffins feel like a real family, the specific texture of their love for each other, expressed through small moments of genuine connection scattered throughout episodes, cannot exist in a show that is primarily concerned with transitioning from one random sketch to the next. The warmth required time and attention that the cutaway format ate. As the cutaways expanded, the warmth contracted. By the later seasons, the Griffins were not really a family. They were a group of people who happened to occupy the same house, occasionally intersecting on the way to their next disconnected joke. The cutaway problem was both symptom and cause. It was a symptom of a writing room that was struggling to generate strong, character-driven stories after so many years. And it was a cause of the show's inability to develop the skills and instincts required for that kind of storytelling, because the more you lean on a crutch, the weaker the leg beneath it becomes. Part 10. Seth MacFarlane steps back. There is a recurring pattern in the history of creative industries. Someone builds something from almost nothing, a show, a studio, a magazine, a record label pouring into it an unusual concentration of personal vision and personal investment. The thing they build reflects that investment in ways that are hard to fully articulate but immediately recognizable to audiences. There is a specific feeling to work that has been made by someone who cares about it in an irreducible way. Then the thing succeeds. It grows beyond the capacity of one person to control. Other projects present themselves. Other opportunities emerge. The creator begins to spread their attention across a broader range of endeavors, and the original creation, now large enough to sustain itself operationally, becomes one item on an expanding list rather than the central organizing fact of the creator's working life. And slowly, the feeling changes. Seth MacFarlane and Family Guy is almost a textbook version of this pattern. In the early years of the show, MacFarlane was present in ways that went far beyond his formal roles. He was voicing 4 major characters: Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire, which put him in the recording booth for essentially every significant scene. He was hands-on with the writing, involved in story decisions, opinionated about the animation, attentive to the overall creative tone. The show felt like one coherent thing because one person was holding it together, making sure all the parts were pointing in the same direction. The original writing team MacFarlane assembled was, for those first 3 seasons, something approaching a genuine creative unit. Chris Sheridan, Danny Smith, Gary Janetti, Ricky Blitt, Neil Goldman, Garrett Donovan, Matt Weitzman, and Mike Barker had been brought together by MacFarlane and had developed a shared understanding of what the show was and what it should feel like. Their collective sensibility had a coherence that produced the specific texture of those early seasons. The show's rocky early history, canceled, returned, canceled again, disrupted this team. Writers scattered during the periods when the show was off the air. Some came back when it was revived. Many did not. New writers came in, talented people who knew television but who brought different instincts to a show they had not built from scratch. The real departure, though, was MacFarlane's own. Around 2011, MacFarlane stepped back from the active creative role he had occupied since the show began. He remained on the show. He continued voicing his characters. His name remained on the credits in prominent ways. But the day-to-day creative decisions, the story planning, the writing oversight, the judgment calls about what the show should and should not do were handed to other people. The showrunning duties passed primarily to Rich Appel and Alex Sulkin. Meanwhile, MacFarlane's external profile was expanding rapidly. He wrote, directed, produced, and starred in the 2012 film Ted, a comedy about a living stuffed animal. Ted grossed over $500 million worldwide on a production budget of $50 million. It was an enormous success by any measure, and it established MacFarlane as a bankable theatrical filmmaker as well as a television creator. He followed Ted with A Million Ways to Die in the West in 2014, then Ted 2 in 2015. He created and starred in The Orville, a science fiction series that premiered on Fox in 2017 before moving to Hulu, where it attracted a devoted audience. He launched a live-action Ted prequel series for Peacock in 2024. He also pursued a parallel career as a singer, releasing multiple albums of big band and jazz standards that received genuine critical attention. Seth MacFarlane, in the years following his departure from Family Guy's creative helm, was one of the busiest people in Hollywood. He was not neglecting Family Guy. He was simply doing an extraordinary number of other things simultaneously, and Family Guy was no longer the primary focus of his creative energy. The absence of MacFarlane from the creative decision-making of Family Guy was significant, not because Rich Appel and Alex Sulkin were bad showrunners. They were experienced professionals who knew the show well, but because there is a specific kind of knowledge that a creator has about their own creation that cannot be fully transferred or replicated. MacFarlane knew, at a deep and intuitive level, what made Family Guy work. He knew where the line was between dark and cruel, between funny and uncomfortable, between provocative and pointlessly offensive. He knew when Peter's behavior needed to have a consequence and when it could be left unaddressed. He knew which jokes earned their darkness and which ones were just dark. Without MacFarlane in the room making those calls, the show drifted. Not catastrophically and not immediately, but consistently. The calibration that had made those early seasons feel so precisely balanced began to slip. Peter got meaner without a circuit breaker. The cutaways got longer without someone saying they were too long. The shock content escalated without someone asking whether the escalation was serving anything. The showrunners who inherited the show were not making reckless or unintelligent choices. They were making choices in the absence of the specific corrective intelligence that MacFarlane represented. The difference between a good caretaker of something and the person who built the thing from scratch is real, even when the caretaker is talented and well-intentioned. MacFarlane's relationship with Fox became increasingly strained during this period, adding another layer of complication to an already complex situation. MacFarlane is politically liberal in ways that he has been open about throughout his career. Fox, the broadcast network, shares a corporate family with Fox News, and MacFarlane found that association increasingly uncomfortable as the years passed. In 2021, he posted publicly expressing that Tucker Carlson's work on Fox News made him wish Family Guy was on a different network. He compared the experience to a failing marriage, characterizing it as a situation both sides knew was not working. In 2020, MacFarlane signed a significant deal with NBC Universal, reportedly in the range of $200 million over 5 years. His production company, Fuzzy Door Productions, moved its center of gravity away from the Fox ecosystem. His newer projects were being developed for Peacock and Hulu and other platforms with no direct connection to Fox Broadcasting. MacFarlane was building his future elsewhere, and Family Guy remained his primary tie to a network he had publicly said he wanted to leave. This created an unusual dynamic that had few precedents in television. The creator of the show no longer wanted it on the network airing it. He continued to voice the characters because his contract required it and because the money it generated funded projects and causes he cared about. He has spoken specifically about donating to environmental conservation efforts, including Rainforest Trust. But the creative passion that had animated the show's best years was clearly elsewhere. In a 2024 interview, MacFarlane spoke about Family Guy's continued existence in terms that were illuminating in ways he may not have entirely intended. He said he did not see a good reason to stop because people still loved it and it made them happy. He talked about the show having reached escape velocity, a state of existence so long established that there was no logical reason to end it unless the audience stopped caring. He framed the show's continuation in terms of financial utility and audience demand. There was no language in the interview about stories he was burning to tell or creative territory he was eager to explore. Family Guy was continuing because it could, because it was profitable, because the infrastructure of its production was efficient enough that maintaining it cost less than dismantling it. In April 2025, Fox announced that Family Guy had been renewed for 4 additional seasons through the 2028 to 2029 television season in a deal structured with parent company Disney. The show would run through its 30th anniversary. Each new season would consist of 15 episodes. Family Guy was not just surviving. It was being locked in for years into the future regardless of what its ratings looked like, regardless of what its creative vitality was, because the business case remained sound. The show generates money from reruns, streaming rights on Hulu, merchandise, video games, and licensing deals that collectively make a 22-minute episode of new Family Guy worth producing at considerably less cost than most alternatives in its broadcast slot. A show can be profitable and still be a shadow of what it once was. A show can be kept alive by business logic long after its creative life has genuinely ended. Family Guy has become perhaps the clearest example of this principle in the history of American television. A show that continues not because it is great, but because it is economically sensible, because the machinery of its production is efficient, because the brand recognition it carries is too valuable to abandon, even as the specific creative qualities that created that brand have largely dissipated. Part 11. The Rise of Shock Value over Smart Writing. There is an important distinction to be made between dark humor and shock value, and Family Guy in its early seasons understood this distinction with unusual precision. Dark humor takes something uncomfortable or taboo and processes it through intelligence to find the comedy inside it. The darkness is a tool, not an end. The skill is in the processing in the craft that transforms discomfort into laughter by finding the unexpected truth inside the difficult material. Shock value is different. Shock value shows you something extreme and hopes the extremeness is sufficient. It does not process, it does not transform. It places something disturbing in front of you and waits for your reaction, and the reaction it is after is less laughter and more something like a wince, a gasp, a reflexive recoil that can be mistaken for comedic response if you are not paying close attention to what you are actually feeling. The early seasons of Family Guy were dark, they were provocative. They went to places that other animated comedies would not go. This was part of their identity and part of what made them exciting to watch. The Parents Television Council named Family Guy one of the worst primetime shows for family viewing in the year 2000, and again in 2005 and 2006. The Federal Communications Commission received complaints about it. Real-world controversy was not something the show stumbled into accidentally. It was a feature of doing comedy at the edges, where the most interesting territory tends to be. But the early seasons earned their darkness. The provocative content was, by and large, in service of something: a satire, a subversion, a joke that needed the darkness to land. The offense was a mechanism, not a destination. You could generally see the intelligence behind it, even when the intelligence was doing something you found objectionable. The shift that occurred over the course of the show's middle seasons was a gradual displacement of that intelligence by something more direct. The show started showing extreme content, because the extreme content itself was the point. There was no longer necessarily a joke inside the darkness. The darkness was just there, in front of you, and the audience was invited to react to it. Physical violence was the most visible example of this shift. Animation has always included stylized violence. The grammar of cartoon physics is built on it, and nobody who grew up watching characters fall off cliffs and walk away unharmed was confused about the reality of what they were watching. The early Family Guy used cartoon violence in this established tradition. Peter would fall downstairs. Characters would collide with things. Exaggerated consequences would follow, and everyone would be fine by the next scene. This was normal and unproblematic. Starting around season 8 and continuing through subsequent seasons, the violence became more graphic, more realistic in its depictions, and more clearly designed to produce visceral reactions in the viewer rather than laughs. Characters began being shown with specific, detailed injuries, wounds drawn with a care for anatomical accuracy that the exaggerated cartoon violence of the early seasons had never required. Brain matter, eyes no longer properly attached. Wounds that lingered on screen longer than the joke, if there was one, needed them to. Peter was frequently at the center of this escalation, both as perpetrator and as victim. The cartoonish slapstick of early Peter falling down, bumping into things, the extended fight sequences with the giant chicken that were funny because of their absurd duration and cartoon logic gave way to scenes of violence that were harder to categorize. The chicken fights themselves, which in seasons 2 and 3 were genuinely hilarious because they committed fully to the absurdity of an elaborate action sequence happening for reasons that were completely unjustified, eventually returned in later seasons as something more like a formula being applied. The original chicken fights were funny because of their specificity and their inexplicability. The later ones were replications of a form without the essential energy that had made the form interesting. The show's approach to sensitive social subjects also shifted from wit to bluntness over the same period. The early seasons made jokes about race, religion, gender, and other difficult areas that were, at their best, genuinely sharp. The jokes said something. They found the actual comedic potential inside uncomfortable material by engaging with it rather than just pointing at it. Later, the engagement dropped away. The jokes became more direct, more mean-spirited, and less interested in the transformation of discomfort into comedy. The show pointed at difficult things and laughed at them rather than examining them. The difference is substantial. Pointing at something and laughing is easy. Finding what is actually funny inside difficult material requires craft. Political humor followed the same trajectory. Family Guy had always included political content. McFarlane's own politics were present in the show from the beginning, largely through Brian's character, and the show had been making political jokes and references since season 1. But the early political content was relatively light-handed and primarily interested in being funny. The later political content was heavier, more explicit, more directly connected to specific contemporary issues and specific contemporary figures in ways that guaranteed a short shelf life. A well-crafted political joke transcends its moment. It is built on an observation that is true enough and funny enough to work even after the specific context that inspired it has passed. A joke tied to a specific politician's specific scandal from 2015 is not a well-crafted joke. It is a piece of content with an expiration date built into it. The later seasons of Family Guy produced enormous quantities of this disposable material content that was immediately topical, immediately recognizable to anyone following current events, and immediately dated once those events stopped dominating the cultural conversation. Fourth wall breaks became more frequent and more pointed in the later seasons. Characters would acknowledge they were on a television show. They would reference the show's declining ratings or its advancing age. They would make jokes about Fox, about the writing staff, about the fact that the show had been on for too long. Some viewers found this self-deprecating meta-commentary charming. Others found it evasive. A show that makes jokes about its own problems has acknowledged those problems but has not addressed them. And the acknowledgement without the address is a kind of intellectual bad faith. The most troubling version of this pattern was the show's habit of addressing fan criticism through in-show jokes. If fans complained that the cutaways had become too long, there might eventually be an episode that made a joke about cutaways being too long. If fans complained that Meg was being treated cruelly, there might be an episode that directly named the cruelty and then reinstated it. The self-awareness was never actually corrective. It was performative. It said, "We see what you are saying, and we find it mildly amusing, and we are going to keep doing it." A show that knows it is making choices its audience dislikes and continues to make them has moved beyond creative stubbornness into a kind of contempt. Not necessarily for the audience, the people making Family Guy in its later seasons were not sitting around actively wanting to disappoint their viewers, but contempt for the creative standard the show had once held itself to, for the intelligence and craft and genuine warmth that had made those first 3 seasons so good. The later seasons seemed to operate on the assumption that the brand recognition was sufficient, that the audience would come back regardless, that being Family Guy was enough without having to be good. Part 12. The ratings freefall. Opinions about quality can always be contested. A person who genuinely loves the later seasons of Family Guy has every right to their enjoyment, and reasonable people can disagree about whether character changes represent growth or decline, whether cutaway-heavy episodes are satisfying or lazy, whether the show's darkness is earned or gratuitous. These are matters of interpretation. Ratings are not matters of interpretation, they are measurements. They count the number of people who chose to watch something at a specific time on a specific night, and the number they produce is a fact rather than an opinion. The ratings history of Family Guy is a document that tells the story of the show's decline more plainly than any critical analysis could. When Family Guy premiered after Super Bowl 33 on the 31st of January 1999, the first episode drew approximately 22 million viewers. Some portion of that audience was there primarily because the television was already on and the Super Bowl had just ended. That is normal for post-Super Bowl programming. But the audience that remained through the first season represented a genuine following 12.8 million households per episode, placing the show at number 33 overall in the Nielsen ratings for that year. The scheduling chaos that followed Fox moving the show repeatedly across multiple nights and time slots drove the numbers down and eventually contributed to the cancellations. The audience could not find a show that kept moving. This was Fox's failure as much as the show's. When Family Guy returned in 2005 for Season 4, riding the wave of Adult Swim rerun success and DVD sales, the numbers were respectable. Season 4 averaged around 7.9 million viewers. Lower than the original run's peak, but impressive for a show returning from 3 years off the air with a changed writing staff and a competitive Sunday night slot. People showed up. The hype was real. From that point forward, the numbers moved in one direction. Season 13, which aired from 2014 to 2015, averaged 5.86 million viewers. This represented a significant decline from the 7.9 million of the revival season, but it still represented a substantial audience. By the standards of what was happening to television viewership broadly during the streaming era, some of that decline could be attributed to the general fragmentation of the audience across more platforms and more options. The argument had some merit. Then the numbers started dropping faster. Season 20 averaged just 1.31 million viewers, with a ratings mark in the adult 18 to 49 demographic of 0.45. These are not the numbers of a show in decline. These are the numbers of a show in near collapse. A series that had pulled almost 8 million viewers in its revival season was now holding on to fewer than 1.4 million. That is a loss of over 80% of the audience in the span of roughly 15 years. Season 23 averaged approximately 723,000 viewers. Less than 750,000 people watching a show that had once been one of the most talked-about programs on American television. A show that debuted to 22 million viewers post-Super Bowl was now drawing fewer viewers than live in many mid-sized American cities. Fox's network treatment of the show reflected the numbers. For most of its run, Family Guy had been part of Animation Domination, the Sunday night block that was Fox's most valuable animation real estate, anchored by The Simpsons and populated by shows the network considered worth prime attention. Family Guy had been a headliner in that environment for years. In 2019, the show was moved from its longtime 9 p.m. Sunday slot to 9:30 p.m. Not a catastrophic demotion, but a visible one. The anchor position was now for something else. Then, for the 2023 to 2024 broadcast season, Family Guy was removed from the Sunday animation domination block entirely. The show was moved to Wednesday nights. This was the first time Family Guy had aired on a weekday since 2002, when it was being shuffled around by a network that did not know what to do with it just before its first cancellation. The circularity was bitter. Being moved from Sunday night to Wednesday night in the television industry means something specific. It means the network no longer considers you a draw, no longer needs your name to anchor their most prestigious night, no longer believes you will bring in an audience that will justify the prime Sunday slot. Wednesday nights are where shows go when networks are managing down their expectations rather than building them up. And yet here is the paradox that defines Family Guy's current existence. The show continues to be renewed. Fox renewed it in January 2023 for its 22nd and 23rd seasons. In April 2025, the deal with parent company Disney locked in productions through season 27 and the 2028 to 2029 television year. The show was guaranteed years of additional life, even as its live viewership numbers had become almost negligible. The explanation is economics. Family Guy is cheap to produce compared to most alternatives available to a broadcast network. No expensive sets, no large cast of on-screen talent. Voice actors record in a booth. Animation is produced overseas. The operational cost of making an episode of Family Guy is a fraction of what it costs to make an episode of most live-action network dramas or comedies. On top of that, the show generates revenue through channels that have nothing to do with how many people watch new episodes on Wednesday nights. Reruns on Adult Swim, Comedy Central, and FXX. Streaming on Hulu. Merchandise, licensing, gaming, and an enormous back catalog of content that retains value across platforms long after first broadcast. Family Guy has become, in the language of entertainment finance, an asset that generates more revenue than it costs to maintain, and it will continue to be produced as long as that remains true, regardless of whether the live viewership numbers justify it from a purely creative standpoint. This is the quiet tragedy at the center of the whole story. The show is alive because of money, not because of creative vitality. It is being kept on life support by a business model, not by the people who built it or the audience who originally loved it. The machine keeps turning. The episodes keep coming. And somewhere in the distance, the show that began with 22 million people watching and a young animator's genuine enthusiasm for something he had made from almost nothing continues its gradual, commercial fade. Part 13. American Dad Did It Better, The Final Insult. The most damaging indictment of Family Guy's decline is not the ratings, and it is not the critical consensus, and it is not the character analyses or the cutaway tallies. The most damaging indictment is the existence of American Dad. American Dad premiered on the 6th of February 2005, just a few months before Family Guy returned for its 4th season. It was created by Seth MacFarlane along with Mike Barker and Matt Weitzman. It ran on the same network, on the same night, for the same audience. On paper, it looked like Family Guy's younger sibling, a MacFarlane-adjacent product that would live in the shadow of its more established companion. Almost nobody in 2005 thought American Dad would eventually become the better show. It was widely dismissed in those early years as a lesser version of something that already existed, a replication of the animated family sitcom format with a different political valence and a slightly stranger collection of household members. Stan Smith, the patriotic CIA agent dad. Francine, his wife. Haley, their liberal college-age daughter. Steve, their nerdy teenage son. Roger, the alien living in their attic. Klaus, the German man whose brain had been implanted into a goldfish by the CIA. The setup was weirder than Family Guy's on paper, but the execution in those first episodes was thinner, more reliant on the novelty of Stan's extreme conservatism as the engine of its comedy. It drew decent ratings and lukewarm critical notices. It was not a hit. It was just there, airing after Family Guy on Sunday nights and benefiting from the audience that had not yet changed the channel. And then, quietly, incrementally, it got better. While Family Guy was going through every process this script has described, the character flanderization, the cutaway inflation, the heart draining away, the shock value replacement, American Dad was doing the opposite. Its writers were developing their characters, finding their voices, discovering what the show actually was beneath its political satire surface. The show was becoming more itself with each season rather than less. The single most significant structural difference between the two shows is simple. American Dad does not use cutaway gags. This might seem like a minor format distinction, but its implications are profound. Without the ability to insert disconnected random jokes as a substitute for storytelling, the American Dad writers had to make every episode work as a complete story. They could not fill weak scenes with random gags. They could not pad episodes with extended non sequiturs. Every joke had to come from the characters and the situations they were in. Every funny moment had to be earned through plot and character logic. This constraint, and it was a genuine creative constraint in those early years when the show was still finding itself, eventually became the source of the show's strength. Writers forced to make a story work without crutches develop skills that writers who have crutches available never need to acquire. The American Dad writing staff built those skills over years of episodes, and by the time Family Guy's problems were becoming obvious, American Dad was producing some of the most confidently constructed comedic storytelling in American animation. The characters also avoided the flanderization that stripped Family Guy's cast of their complexity. Stan Smith began as a broadly drawn conservative caricature, and that simplicity was a legitimate early criticism. But the writers allowed Stan to grow. They gave him a genuine interior life. They made him stubborn and frequently wrong without making him cruel in the way that Peter Griffin became cruel. He had episodes where he was the hero and episodes where he was the villain, and both were credible because the writers had built a character who was complicated enough to be both. His love for his family was not just asserted but demonstrated, and when he made mistakes, which was often the show allowed those mistakes to have consequences that shaped subsequent episodes and shaped Stan himself. Roger the Alien became one of the most inventive recurring characters in American animation through a concept that was designed to never run dry. Roger had the ability to adopt different personas, entirely different names, different personalities, different backstories, different professions, essentially becoming a new character in every episode while remaining recognizably himself underneath. This gave the writers an endless generative engine. Every episode could feature a different version of Roger, each one more elaborately absurd than the last, and the concept would never exhaust itself because it was built on limitlessness. Compare this to what happened with Stewie's evil genius concept, which the show abandoned after 3 seasons on the grounds that it had been explored thoroughly enough, despite the fact that American Dad would go on to demonstrate with Roger that an original character concept can sustain an entire show's run if managed with genuine creativity. Francine Smith avoided the decline that Lois Griffin suffered. She remained warm, occasionally wild, and genuinely funny without being repurposed as a vehicle for contempt or cruelty toward other characters. Haley and Steve maintained their essential personalities across the show's run while still developing. Klaus the Fish was the household punching bag, absorbing jokes at his expense in ways that were actually funny because the role had been designed into him from the beginning. He was not a fully realized character who had been retrospectively converted into a target, which was the process that had happened to Meg. The warmth that the early Family Guy had, the specific sense that the Griffins were a real family underneath all the dysfunction, that they loved each other in ways that occasionally mattered, is something that American Dad sustained throughout its run. The Smiths are dysfunctional. They fight. Stan does infuriating things. But there is a warmth at the center of the show that never fully disappears. A sense that these people genuinely want the best for each other even when they are failing to act on that desire. That warmth is what the Griffin family had in seasons 1 through 3 and gradually lost thereafter. The fan and critical consensus shifted over the years in ways that became increasingly impossible to ignore. By the middle of the show's run, American Dad was being consistently rated above Family Guy in quality comparisons among people who watched both shows. Online discussions filled with people who had given up on New Family Guy, saying that American Dad was giving them everything they had originally loved about the earlier show. Critics who had dismissed American Dad in its early years were revisiting it with genuine respect. American Dad also navigated a significant transition more gracefully than most shows manage. After 11 seasons on Fox, the show moved to TBS for its 12th season. Moving a show off a broadcast network onto cable after more than a decade typically signals either decline or irrelevance. For American Dad, the move provided more creative freedom, and the show continued to produce quality episodes without apparent disruption. The comparison matters because it dismantles the most common defensive argument made on behalf of Family Guy's later seasons. The argument goes like this: any show running for more than 20 years will inevitably decline in quality. Creative fatigue is a natural consequence of sustained production over a long period. No comedy can stay fresh indefinitely. Therefore, Family Guy's decline should be understood as an inevitable outcome rather than a result of specific choices. American Dad is the direct refutation of this argument. American Dad has been running for essentially the same length of time as the post-revival Family Guy, in the same animation format, on the same network, produced by overlapping creative teams. It has not suffered the same catastrophic quality collapse. It has maintained consistent character integrity, continued to produce acclaimed episodes, and avoided the specific traps that Family Guy repeatedly fell into. If decline after 20 years were inevitable, American Dad would have declined too. It has not. The decline is not about time. It is about choices. Specifically and precisely, it is about the choice to Flanderize Peter, to turn Brian into a fraud, to retire evil Stewie in favor of something less original, to abuse Meg for a decade, to substitute cutaways for storytelling, to replace wit with shock value, and to continue producing the show after the person who understood it best had moved on to other things. None of those choices were inevitable. They were made, each of them, by specific people in specific rooms at specific moments. They were made, one imagines, in good faith, by people who were trying to make a funny show. But good faith is not sufficient protection against cumulative drift, and the drift that accumulated across Family Guy's long middle period was enormous. American Dad's ongoing quality is in this sense the final and most precise measure of Family Guy's specific failure. It shows what was possible. It shows that the format was not the problem, and the genre was not the problem, and the network was not the problem, and the passage of time was not the problem. It shows that when the right choices are made, consistently, over many seasons, an animated family comedy can stay genuinely good for a very long time. Family Guy was once one of the greatest animated comedies ever made. It changed television. It influenced a generation of comedy. It came back from death twice because people loved it that much. It was nominated for a Primetime Emmy for Outstanding Comedy Series in 2009, the first animated series to receive that nomination since The Flintstones in 1961. TV Guide ranked it the 9th greatest television cartoon of all time in 2013. The cultural impact of those first several seasons was real and lasting and deserved. And then, season by season, one choice at a time, it became something smaller, something hollower, something that kept the shape of the original while the substance inside it diminished. Part 14. What Remains and What Was Lost. There is a particular kind of sadness in watching something you loved become less than it was. Not destroyed, not gone, just reduced. Still present, still bearing the familiar marks of what you loved about it, but carrying them the way an old photograph carries likeness, capturing the surface, while the living thing that made the surface meaningful has moved elsewhere. Family Guy occupies that space now. The show that exists today is recognizably connected to the show that premiered in 1999. The characters have the same names. The setting is the same fictional New England city. The voice cast is largely intact. Seth MacFarlane is still in the recording booth, still giving Peter and Brian and Stewie and Quagmire the specific vocal qualities that made them recognizable in the first place. The continuity of form is real. But the show that captivated 22 million people after the Super Bowl, that built its cult following through Adult Swim reruns and DVD copies that fans purchased and loaned to friends, that was sharp and warm and genuinely funny, in ways that felt fresh and original, that show is not quite the same thing as what airs on Wednesday nights now to fewer than 1 million viewers. What was great about Family Guy at its peak was not any single thing. It was a combination of precise elements that happened to be in alignment at a specific time. The writing, the character dynamics, the specific sensibility of the MacFarlane-era team, the willingness to be dark without losing the warmth that made the darkness bearable, the cutaways that were brief and sharp and surprising, the Griffins who loved each other imperfectly but genuinely, the evil genius baby, the voice of reason in a dog suit, the ordinary teenager in an extraordinary household. These things existed in combination and in balance during seasons 1 through 3, and the combination produced something that millions of people connected with in ways that were real enough to resurrect a dead show twice. The lesson that the show's history teaches is not that comedies inevitably decline. American Dad is still running and still considered good. The lesson is about the specific vulnerability of any creative endeavor to the slow erosion of the qualities that made it special, when the people responsible for maintaining those qualities are no longer in a position to do so, either because they have moved on or because they have lost the thread of what the thing originally was. McFarlane created something remarkable. The writing team of those early seasons was remarkable. The characters they built together, at that specific moment in that specific collaboration, were remarkable. What happened over the following 2 decades was not remarkable. It was ordinary. It was what happens when something that was built with care and precision and personal investment gets handed to a production machine that is focused on sustaining it as efficiently as possible. The golden years remain. Seasons 1 through 3 are still there, still funny, still surprising in the way things that are genuinely well made tend to remain surprising regardless of their age. The early revival seasons still have their moments of genuine brilliance. There are episodes scattered throughout the later run that show what the show could do when everyone in the room was committed to making something excellent rather than something adequate. The record of what Family Guy was, at its best, is real and permanent. Nothing that happened afterward can retroactively diminish it. The Peter Griffin of Season 1, who loved his family with the helpless enthusiasm of a man who consistently overestimated his own competence and was saved by the depth of his affection for the people around him, is still that character. The Brian Griffin who rolled his eyes at the world while quietly caring about everything and everyone in it is still that character. The evil genius baby in the yellow shirt is still building laser cannons in his bedroom and monologuing about the enslavement of humanity while his mother buckles him into the car seat. They are still there. In the archive. In the memory of everyone who watched those seasons when they aired or discovered them later. In the cultural record of what American animation was capable of in those years. What is sad is not that those things are gone. What is sad is knowing what they could have remained if the specific choices had been different. If the cutaways had been kept brief. If Peter's capacity for love had been maintained alongside his capacity for chaos. If Brian's intelligence had been kept honest. If Stewie had been allowed to keep his edge, if Meg had been allowed to be a person, none of these things required extraordinary talent that was not available. American Dad demonstrates that the talent was there. The instinct was there. The institutional knowledge of how to make this kind of comedy was present in the people who were making Family Guy. They simply made different choices, season by season, and the different choices accumulated into the distance between what the show was and what it became. Family Guy did not just get worse every season. It made choices that led to getting worse every season. And that distinction, between the inevitable and the chosen, between what had to happen and what was decided upon, is the thing that makes the whole story genuinely melancholy to sit with. It was not fate. It was a sequence of decisions, each one slightly wrong, adding up over time to something very wrong indeed. The Griffin family is still there, on Wednesday nights, on Hulu, in reruns at odd hours on cable, still making the cutaway jokes, still giving Peter Griffin his loud and impulsive life, still putting Brian through his paces, still sending Stewie and Brian on their adventures, still carrying Meg through whatever the writing staff has assigned her this week. The show is alive. Whether it is living is a different question. And that is probably the most honest thing you can say about Family Guy in 2025. It is alive, and it remembers having been something greater, and it continues. If you made it all the way here, thank you genuinely and deeply for spending this time with this story. Drop a like if you enjoyed the video, and if you are not already subscribed, this is the moment to do it. It costs nothing, and it means everything for keeping this channel able to make more videos like this one. See you next time. End of script. Extended sections. Full script continuation for 30,000 plus word target. Extended reflections. The writer's room and the shape of decline. To fully understand what happened to Family Guy across its long, complicated run, it helps to think about the specific conditions inside a television writing room and how those conditions change when a show shifts from being a passion project into being a legacy property, something that continues because it has. Always continued because the infrastructure exists, because the cancellation would itself be a news event, rather than because anyone in the room is burning with the specific desire to make these particular characters say these particular things. In the early seasons of any show that becomes genuinely great, there is a specific energy present in the writing room that is very difficult to sustain over many years. It is the energy of people who are trying to prove something. not to each other necessarily or even consciously, but to the culture, to the television landscape, to the form itself. The people in that room believe they are making something that matters, that has not been made before, that justifies the late nights and the arguments and the endless revisions by being genuinely worth the trouble. The original Family Guy writing team had this quality in abundance. They were making a show that had a specific comedic vision, that was pushing against the boundaries of what animated comedy was supposed to do, that believed in the characters enough to give them real interior lives, rather than just exaggerated exterior types. MacFarlane himself was the primary driver of this vision, but he was surrounded by writers who understood and contributed to it, who were genuinely invested in making the show as good as it could be. This investment shows in the work. You can feel it watching those early episodes today. There is a care in the construction of scenes, a precision in the deployment of jokes, a sense that every choice was made rather than simply inherited from the scene before it. The show has the texture of something that someone wanted to make, not just something that was made. What happens to a writing room after 10 years, 15 years, 20 years of producing the same show? The best-case scenario is that the original energy mutates into something different but equally valuable, the deep expertise and settled confidence of people who know their material thoroughly and can find new things inside it, because they have spent so long with it. Some shows manage this. The kind of sustained, creative engagement required for it is rare, but it is not impossible. The more common case is a gradual drift toward professionalism over passion. The writers in the room become very good at making Family Guy in a technical sense, good at the format, good at the pacing, good at the established jokes and the established character types. They are no longer proving anything. They are executing. And execution without the energy of genuine creative investment produces a different kind of work. Competent, consistent, recognizably the same show, but without the edge that comes from people who are still surprised and delighted by what they are making. This drift is visible in Family Guy's later seasons in specific ways. The jokes are correctly structured but often feel assembled rather than discovered. The character beats are recognizable and reliably delivered but rarely feel genuinely earned. The show knows how to do everything it does. It has been doing it for a long time, but the doing of it has become, to some degree, the point. The question, why are we doing this, has been replaced by, how do we do this most efficiently? MacFarlane's departure from active creative involvement accelerated this drift by removing the one person in the building for whom the why question was most live. MacFarlane had created these characters. He had specific relationships with their essential qualities that went beyond craft into something more personal. His presence in the creative process was a constant implicit argument that the show needed to justify itself at each step, that being Family Guy was not sufficient on its own, that the show needed to earn the right to continue with each season's decisions rather than simply continuing on inertia. Without that implicit argument being made, inertia became the dominant force. The show kept going because it had been going. The characters kept being used in established ways because those were the established ways. The cutaways kept multiplying because they had been multiplying. No one was asking, with any frequency or force, whether the direction was the right one. This is not unique to Family Guy. It is what happens to almost every long-running show eventually. The remarkable thing about some shows, The Simpsons at its peak, American Dad across most of its run, Arrested Development in its original 3-season run, Parks and Recreation in its middle and late seasons, is that they found ways to resist the drift, to maintain the asking of the why question, even when the institutional pressures were all pushing toward, simply continuing on the established path. The tragedy of Family Guy's later seasons is not that the drift happened. The tragedy is that it was not inevitable. American Dad demonstrates this. The same network, the same format, the same production universe. Different outcomes, because different choices were made consistently over many years by people who kept asking the why question rather than simply executing the established pattern. Extended reflections. The audience that left and what it meant. Ratings are abstractions until you think about what they actually represent. Every viewer who chose not to watch Family Guy in a given season was a person who had, at some prior point, made the decision to watch it. They were part of the original audience, or the revival audience, or the Adult Swim audience. They had chosen the show, invested in it to some degree, made it part of their television habit, and then, at some point, they made a different choice. They decided that the time spent watching new Family Guy was not returning value that justified the investment. This kind of departure is different from never having found a show in the first place. The people who left Family Guy between the revival peak and the later season lows were not people who had been indifferent. They were people who had cared and then found the caring was no longer sustainable in the face of what the show had become. The numbers tell a specific story. Approximately 7.9 million viewers in Season 4. Approximately 723,000 viewers in Season 23. The arithmetic of that decline is staggering when you lay it out plainly. Roughly 7 million people who had watched new Family Guy at some point in the mid-2000s were no longer watching it by the early 2020s. 7 million specific decisions, made by specific people, to find something else to do with the hour that used to contain new Family Guy. 7 million departures are not a statistical fluctuation. They are not explained by the general fragmentation of media consumption across streaming platforms, though that was certainly a real factor. The competition for attention has never been more intense than it has been over the last decade, and every broadcast network show has lost audience to streaming alternatives. But American Dad, operating in exactly the same environment, maintained a much more stable viewership relative to its own peaks. The fragmentation argument does not explain the differential. The differential is explained by the quality differential. People left Family Guy more comprehensively than they left American Dad because Family Guy gave them more to leave. The specific disappointments accumulated differently. The specific gap between what the show had been and what it was now was wider, and the people who remembered what it had been were more acutely aware of the distance. There is something worth honoring in the collective act of all those departures. 7 million people deciding that they would rather not watch than watch a diminished version of something they had loved is not cynicism. It is a kind of faithfulness. They cared enough about what the show had been to be unwilling to pretend that what it had become was equivalent. They held a standard and refused to lower it simply because lowering it would have been more comfortable. The people who stayed, the nearly 750,000 viewers who were still watching Season 23, present a different picture. Some of them had always been there. Some had not started watching until later and had no prior version against which to measure disappointment. Some found genuine enjoyment in the show's later mode that was different from, but not lesser than, what earlier viewers had found in the original. All of these people have perfectly valid reasons for watching, and their enjoyment is real regardless of how the numbers compare to earlier peaks. But the comprehensive departure of the original audience is itself data about the show's trajectory, and it is data that points in the same direction as everything else this script has been examining. The people who loved the show when it was at its best left when it stopped being its best. The people who stayed were either new arrivals without the comparative context or committed veterans who found enough in the current version to justify continuing. The middle ground, the audience that had been with the show since the beginning and had stayed through the decline because the decline had not been sufficient to drive them away, had largely gone. Extended reflections. What made the golden seasons truly golden? It is worth spending more time with what specifically made seasons 1 through 3 of Family Guy as good as they were, because the qualities that made them great are precisely the qualities whose absence in the later seasons explains the decline most directly. The first and most fundamental quality was unity of vision. MacFarlane had a specific idea of what the show was and what it should feel like, and that idea was strong enough and clear enough to persist through every scene and every joke. Watching an early Family Guy episode, you never feel uncertain about the show's relationship to its own material. The tone is consistent. The balance between comedy and warmth is stable. The specific sensibility of the whole thing is present in every piece. This kind of coherence requires someone to be actively maintaining it, constantly making decisions that keep all the parts pointing in the same direction. Unity of vision is easy to describe and difficult to achieve. It requires the person holding the vision to be genuinely invested in the material, attentive to when things start to drift, and willing to push back against the institutional momentum towards simply doing the next thing, because the next thing is what comes next. MacFarlane in those early years had all of these qualities in abundance. The loss of his active creative involvement removed the primary mechanism for maintaining the coherence that made those seasons feel so precisely right. The second quality was the genuine humanity of the characters. Underneath their exaggerations, underneath the comedy of their types, the early Griffins were recognizably human in ways that made them worth caring about. Peter's love for Lois was real. Brian's frustrated ambition was real. Stewie's extraordinary inner life, contained in such an incongruous exterior, was real in the sense that creative reality conveys you believed in it, the way you believe in the specific inner lives of characters in the best novels. The show was making an implicit argument that these characters had interiority, that they were not just joke delivery systems but something approaching people, and the argument was convincing. Genuine humanity in characters is what generates the emotional investment that makes Comedy land with its full force. When something is funny and also true, when the joke reveals something about a person you actually care about, the laughter is different in kind and quality from the laughter at a well-crafted gag. The early seasons generated this deeper laughter regularly. The later seasons generated the shallower kind more and more. The third quality was economy. The early seasons did not waste anything. Scenes were as long as they needed to be. Cutaways were as brief as they needed to be. Characters said what they needed to say and stopped. The restraint of good early television comedy is often invisible. You don't notice it because the experience of watching it is so smooth and satisfying that there is nothing to catch your attention. But go back and compare the pacing of a Season 1 episode to a Season 12 episode, and the difference is stark. Season 1 is a precision instrument. Season 12 is a blunt one. Economy in comedy is closely related to confidence. A show that trusts its own material cuts away at the right moment, ends scenes before they overstay, lets jokes breathe without suffocating them with additional material. A show that is uncertain about whether it is landing covers its uncertainty by adding more time on the joke, more repetitions, more volume, more extreme content. The accumulation of this uncertainty across many seasons produces the bloated, extended, shock-dependent comedy that characterizes the show's later run. These three qualities, unity of vision, genuine humanity, economy, were present in the early seasons and absent, in varying degrees, from the later ones. Their absence is the explanation for the decline. Not one big catastrophic failure, but the gradual erosion of specific things that had made the show genuinely excellent. Each erosion small enough in itself to be explained away, collectively large enough to constitute the distance between what Family Guy was and what it became. Extended reflections, legacy, memory, and the archive of excellence. At some point in the discussion of a show's decline, it becomes worth asking what the lasting legacy looks like, not the decline, which is well documented and extensively analyzed, but the genuine achievement, which was real and should not be obscured by the much longer and more visible story of what came after. Family Guy, in its best seasons, was a show that did things that had not been done before. The cutaway format, whatever it eventually became in the show's later years, was a genuine formal innovation in those early seasons. The use of completely disconnected, rapidly edited, absurdist humor as a consistent structural feature of an animated comedy was not standard practice before Family Guy made it one. The show influenced the shape of comedy on the internet, the rhythm of meme culture, the specific kind of lateral humor that has become so embedded in how humor works online that many people who know it well do not know that Family Guy was a primary vehicle for its dissemination. The characters at their best were genuinely memorable in the way that characters in good literature are memorable, specific enough to feel real, exaggerated enough to feel larger than real, and emotionally coherent enough to feel true. Early Brian Griffin is a character who has earned a place in the taxonomy of great American comedy characters, alongside the best of what The Simpsons produced in its peak years, and what Arrested Development achieved, and what other genuinely excellent American comedies have given the culture over the decades. He was that good, specifically during that window. The fact that he became something less than that later does not retroactively diminish what he was. Stewie, during those first 3 seasons, was genuinely original in a way that genuine originality is rare. The Evil Genius Baby was not a riff on something that existed. It was its own thing, entirely itself, born from a specific imagination at a specific moment. The fact that the character was subsequently transformed into something more available and less singular does not erase the 3 seasons during which he was exactly what he was supposed to be. Those seasons remain available. The archive is intact. The show's cultural impact is real and documented. The Emmy nomination in 2009 for Outstanding Comedy Series, the first animated series to receive that honor since The Flintstones in 1961, is a measure of the genuine esteem the show commanded during its best years. The TV Guide ranking as the 9th greatest television cartoon of all time reflects a genuine assessment of the show's importance to the form. These things coexist with the decline. The story of Family Guy is both a story of genuine achievement and a story of that achievement being whittled away over time by the accumulation of wrong choices. Both stories are true. The achievement was real. The decline was real. Holding both simultaneously, without letting either one cancel the other, is the only honest way to understand what Family Guy was and what it became. The show that returns each week, now on Wednesday nights to its diminished audience, carries those early seasons in its DNA even when the current production seems to have forgotten them. The voice of early Peter is still in McFarlane's performance, even when the writing gives him nowhere interesting to go. The ghost of early Brian haunts every scene in which later Brian falls short. Stewie's yellow shirt contains the memory of what the character was, even as the current version of the character is doing something completely different. Family Guy did not have to get worse every season. It was not fated. American Dad proves that. The specific qualities that made the early seasons extraordinary were sustainable. They required work and attention, and the sustained asking of difficult creative questions. They required someone in the room who cared enough to push back when the choices were wrong. When those things were present, the show was genuinely excellent. When they were absent, the show drifted. The drift happened slowly enough that it was possible to not notice it fully until you went back and compared. Season 4 was not catastrophically different from Season 3. Season 7 was not catastrophically different from Season 6. But Season 15 was catastrophically different from Season 3. And the path from one to the other, followed slowly and step by step, is the path this script has been tracing. The Peter Griffin of Season 1 told Lois he loved her, and you believed him. And that belief was the emotional core of everything funny in the episode around it. The Stewie of Season 1 plotted his mother's destruction from inside his high chair, and the absurdity of that image never ran out of comic energy. The Brian of Season 1 watched the chaos of the Griffin household with dry, affectionate exasperation, and his watchfulness made everything funnier. The Meg of Season 1 was just a teenager who wanted to be noticed, and her ordinariness was a kind of grace note inside the extraordinary noise. Those characters, in those seasons, were as good as television gets. The record of them is permanent. It is available to anyone who wants to find it. And whatever the show has become in the years since, whatever Wednesday night iterations have arrived and aired and been forgotten, those specific seasons remain. Proof that when Family Guy was great, it was genuinely, inarguably great. That is the whole story. And it is, finally, a sad one, but also a true one. And the best stories are usually both. If you have watched all the way to here, genuinely, thank you. This kind of video takes a long time and considerable care to make, and knowing that someone stayed with it through all of it means a great deal. Like the video if it gave you something. Subscribe if you want more of this. And take your time getting up, there is no rush. See you next time. End of script. Extended reflections. The specific mechanics of character love. When we talk about why the early Griffin family worked as a comedic unit, we are really talking about something that sits at the intersection of craft and feeling that is difficult to fully describe without resorting to the kind of abstractions that explain everything and nothing simultaneously. So let us try to be more specific. What made you love early Peter Griffin was not that he was sympathetic in the conventional sense. He was not the underdog hero. He was not the put-upon everyman fighting against a system rigged against him. He was not particularly admirable or particularly aspirational. He was overweight and not very smart, and made consistently bad decisions and dragged the people around him into those decisions without adequate warning. By any rational accounting, he was more of a problem than a pleasure. But the show gave him something underneath all of that which changed the mathematics completely. It gave him joy. Early Peter Griffin was a man who found genuine joy in things. He found joy in beer and in his friends at the bar and in television from the 1970s, and in his family, especially when his family was not currently the subject of whatever disaster he had set in motion. His joy was specific and unself-conscious and completely impervious to the evidence of whether it was appropriate to the circumstances. He was joyful at the wrong times. He was joyful in situations that did not warrant joy. He was joyful with a consistency that should have been exhausting but was instead, in those early seasons, a kind of gift. The joy mattered because it was what transformed his stupidity from cold to warm. A stupid person without joy is just a problem. A stupid person with genuine, uncomplicated, impervious joy is a character you can spend time with, because the joy is contagious in ways that the stupidity is not. Early Peter made you feel the specific happiness of a person who is not very smart but is not burdened by knowing it, who moves through the world with a confidence that is completely unjustified and yet somehow sustaining. It was a very specific kind of comedy that required the joy to be real in order to work. The later seasons stripped the joy out of Peter by degrees. The behavior that replaced it, the cruelty, the selfishness, the aggression toward his own family had no joy in it. It had energy, but energy is not the same thing as joy. Watching later Peter do terrible things was not the same experience as watching early Peter do idiotic things. Early Peter's idiocy came from a full, overflowing person who could not contain his enthusiasm for things that were mostly not worth being enthusiastic about. Later, Peter's behavior came from a diminished thing, hollowed out of the quality that had made the character worth loving in the first place. The same analysis applies to Brian, but in the other direction. What made early Brian work was not that he was the smartest one in the room, though he was. It was that his intelligence coexisted with genuine humility about the limits of his own understanding. He was smart enough to see clearly, but not so arrogant as to believe that seeing clearly was sufficient. He knew that knowing the right thing and doing the right thing were different operations. He knew that having read the right books did not exempt you from making bad decisions in your own life. His intelligence was self-aware in the specific way that distinguishes real intelligence from the performance of intelligence. The later Brian had the performance without the self-awareness. He claimed intelligence without backing it up consistently. He claimed moral superiority while behaving in ways that were morally indefensible. The gap between his self-perception and his actual behavior was the engine of his later comedy in many episodes, but it was not the kind of comedy that generates affection. It was the kind that generates exasperation, and exasperation sustained over many seasons eventually becomes something more like contempt. Stewie's joy in his early form was different from Peter's but equally essential to the character's appeal. Early Stewie had the joy of competence. He was very good at the specific things he had decided to be good at, and the show allowed him to take genuine pleasure in that competence. When he built something that worked, when a plan came together with the precision he had designed it for, when he delivered a monologue that hit every beat he had intended, there was satisfaction in it that the character felt and the audience felt with him. He was awful, but he was awful with such focused excellence that you could not help admiring the craftsmanship even as you were horrified by the application. The later Stewie's pleasures were more ordinary. He enjoyed Brian's company, he enjoyed adventures, he enjoyed the specific emotional textures of his friendship and his identity exploration. These are not bad pleasures, and the show depicted them with genuine warmth, but they are available pleasures, pleasures that other characters in other shows also experience. The specific joy of being the most competent and most dangerous thing in any room, the joy of the evil genius who knows exactly what he is and is entirely at peace with it, that joy belonged to early Stewie and to no one else. Extended reflections, the cultural timing and why it mattered. Family Guy arrived at a specific cultural moment that it was, perhaps uniquely, positioned to take advantage of. 1999 to 2002 was a period of relative stability in the American media landscape, before streaming had fragmented attention, before social media had transformed how comedy traveled and how audiences formed around it, before the internet had fully become the primary vehicle for the kind of irreverent, unexpected humor that Family Guy excelled at. The show's revival in 2005 coincided almost precisely with the launch of YouTube, and this coincidence was not irrelevant to the show's cultural impact during the post-revival period. The format of the cutaway gag was essentially a short video before short videos were a cultural phenomenon. A 15-second Family Guy clip, lifted from its episode and uploaded to a platform designed for exactly that kind of sharing, was perfectly suited to the emerging mechanics of internet comedy distribution. Family Guy became viral in the specific, accelerated way that the internet enabled, and this virality served the show's profile enormously during a period when the show's quality was already beginning to drift. This is worth noting because it complicates the simple narrative of decline. The period during which Family Guy's creative quality was beginning to slip was also the period during which the show's cultural presence was at its largest. The viral clips from the Season 4 to Season 8 era were not all from the show's worst episodes. They were from a version of the show that was still producing individually excellent moments, even as the episodes those moments lived in were becoming less cohesive and less meaningful as complete stories. This created a specific kind of audience relationship that was different from the relationship audiences had with the early seasons. The early audience had to watch complete episodes to get their Family Guy. They had to sit through the stories, engage with the character development, process the show as a whole experience. This relationship with the complete episode was what gave the early audience its investment in the characters and its capacity to be moved by the emotional beats embedded inside the comedy. The viral clip audience related to Family Guy differently. They encountered it in 30-second excerpts on YouTube, in gifted clips on social media, in the specific highlights that were optimized for sharing rather than for storytelling. This audience's relationship with the show was real but shallower. They knew the characters as types, they recognized the jokes, they could quote the famous lines. But they had not necessarily sat through complete episodes in the way that built the deeper investment the early audience had. This bifurcated audience was one of the conditions under which the show's evolution became less corrected by fan response than it might otherwise have been. The people who were most attuned to the decline, the longtime viewers who had loved the early seasons and were watching the later seasons with the comparison active in their minds, were leaving. The people who remained were either new arrivals who did not have that comparison or viral clip fans whose relationship with the show was not deep enough to register the specific losses as losses. The feedback mechanism was impaired. Had the show existed in a media environment where complete episode viewership was the primary way people encountered it, the decline might have been more acutely felt more quickly, and the response might have been more corrective. The viral clip era provided a buffer, a way for the show to maintain cultural visibility and apparent health, while its actual storytelling quality was deteriorating. The clips kept being shareable even as the episodes around them were becoming less worth watching. This observation is not meant as a criticism of the people who enjoyed Family Guy primarily through clips. There is nothing wrong with that form of engagement. It is simply a way of understanding how the conditions of the show's cultural life in that specific era may have obscured the pace of its creative decline even from the people making it. Extended reflections. The weight of continuity and what it costs. One of the subtler problems that accumulates in very long-running shows is the weight of their own continuity, the accumulated record of everything that has happened before, every character choice, every plot development, every joke about how the characters relate to each other, slowly becoming a set of constraints on what the show can do. In the early seasons of Family Guy, the characters were relatively free. They had been established but not yet over-established. There was space to move. Peter could show warmth and vulnerability because not enough scenes of Peter being callous had accumulated to make warmth feel inconsistent. Brian could be genuinely helpful and kind because not enough scenes of Brian being selfish had accumulated to make kindness feel like a surprise. The characters had room to be multidimensional because the dimensions had not yet been foreclosed by the weight of what had come before. As the seasons accumulated, this freedom narrowed. The show had established specific things about each character so many times that departing from those established things felt jarring rather than dimensional. Peter being cruel had been shown enough times that Peter being genuinely warm felt, in later seasons, like a one-off exception rather than a true dimension of the character. Brian being self-righteous had been demonstrated often enough that Brian being genuinely thoughtful felt like an aberration rather than a return to what had always been true about him. The show addressed this problem occasionally by deploying the reset button, the episode that fundamentally changed something about a character relationship, revealed new dimensions, suggested that things would be different going forward, and then was promptly ignored by the following episode. Peter and Meg have a genuine reconciliation, and the next episode Peter is back to treating Meg with contempt. Brian has a moment of real self-awareness about his failings, and the next episode Brian is back to his established patterns. The reset provided the emotional satisfaction of the change without the narrative cost of having to maintain it. This technique is self-defeating over time because audiences learn to discount the weight of any given development. If the reconciliations never stick, the reconciliations stop mattering emotionally. If the character revelations are never integrated into subsequent behavior, the revelations stop registering as genuine. The show trains its audience to understand that nothing that happens will have lasting consequences, and then is surprised when the audience stops caring about what happens. American Dad avoided this trap partly by actually letting its character changes stick. Stan Smith, across the show's run, was changed by his experiences in ways that carried forward. Not dramatically, not always obviously, but the Stan of Season 12 was a different character from the Stan of Season 1 in ways that were rooted in the specific experiences the show had given him. The accumulation worked in American Dad's favor because it was allowed to do real work on the characters. In Family Guy, the accumulation worked against the show because the changes it tried to make were systematically undone before they could take root. Extended reflections. The sound of Family Guy and what the voices carried. There is something worth noting about the voice performances in Family Guy across its entire run, because they represent one of the few elements that remained consistently excellent even as everything around them changed. MacFarlane voicing 4 major characters simultaneously was an extraordinary act of craft that was easy to take for granted because it was so seamlessly done. Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire are 4 completely distinct vocal presences. They have different tempos, different textures, different relationships to the rhythm of their sentences. Peter's voice has a specific kind of effortful confidence, a quality of a man saying things with more certainty than his grasp of them warrants. Brian's voice has a dry, considered quality, a voice that thinks before it speaks even when what it eventually says is wrong or self-serving. Stewie's voice has the particular precision of someone who has decided that every sentence is worth full enunciation, a voice that treats ordinary conversation as a performance. Quagmire has a specific rhythmic quality, a voice that knows where its jokes are going before the sentence begins and is already halfway there by the time it arrives. These performances never degraded. Whatever happened to the characters in the writing, whatever choices were made about their behavior and their relationships, the vocal performances remained as precise and as specific as they had always been. MacFarlane in the recording booth was still doing excellent work even when the scripts he was recording were not excellent scripts. This created a slightly strange quality in the later seasons. The performances were still right, still exactly what these characters sounded like, but they were being applied to material that was no longer worth the quality of the performance. Alex Borstein as Lois, Seth Green as Chris, Mila Kunis as Meg, these performers similarly maintained their craft and their commitment across the show's entire run. The quality of what they were given to work with varied enormously from season to season and from episode to episode. Their quality did not. There is something melancholy about this. The talent was present. The vocal performances were as strong in season 20 as they had been in season 1. The instrument was intact. What had changed was what was being played on it. This is worth naming specifically because it is the piece of the whole story that is hardest to explain to someone who has only ever watched the show in its later seasons. If you come to Family Guy in season 18, the voices sound exactly like Family Guy is supposed to sound. Peter sounds like Peter, Brian sounds like Brian, Stewie sounds like Stewie. The voices are right. The comedy has the correct surface texture of the form. It is only when you sit with the early seasons that the depth of what has been lost becomes audible, not in the voices themselves, which are still accurate, but in what the voices are being given to express, and how much smaller that thing is than what it used to be. A final note on what good comedy requires. Great comedy, at its deepest level, requires the audience to care. Not in the way that drama requires caring, not the sustained, heavy emotional investment of following characters through genuine crisis, but in a specific, lighter way. The audience needs to have some relationship with the characters or the situations that makes the jokes land with force rather than just technical accuracy. A joke about someone you genuinely know, even superficially, is funnier than the same joke about a stranger. Early Family Guy gave its audience people to know. The Griffins had enough specificity and enough genuine humanity that you knew them, at least a little, in the way you know people from television who have been written with care. Peter's particular brand of self-assured incompetence, Brian's specific combination of aspiration and failure, Stewie's magnificent outrage at the indignities of infancy, Meg's quiet, persistent hope for something better. These were real enough to generate the caring, and the caring made the comedy work the way good comedy works. The later seasons could not fully replicate this effect even when individual jokes were well constructed, because the characters had been transformed in ways that made caring about them more difficult. A character you do not quite trust, whose behavior is too inconsistent, whose cruelty is too casual, whose relationship to their own stated values is too dishonest, generates a different response from an audience than a character with whom a genuine relationship has been established and maintained. The audience for the early seasons cared about the Griffins. Not deeply, not in the way you care about characters in the novels that change how you see the world, but genuinely, in the specific way that good television can generate. That caring made everything funnier. The absence of caring in the later seasons made everything flatter. This is the essential dynamic underneath all the specific analysis of cutaway frequency and character flanderization and shock value escalation. All of those things mattered, and all of them contributed to the decline. But they mattered because they progressively removed the conditions under which the audience could care about the people in the show. When the conditions for caring were present, the comedy worked. When they were removed, the comedy was technically present but emotionally hollow. Family Guy knew how to establish those conditions once. It did it for 3 seasons, and then again intermittently in the revival years, and in individual episodes scattered throughout the later run. The knowledge was in the building. The writers who had built the early seasons had demonstrated that they understood what the conditions for caring looked like and how to create them. The tragedy of the long decline is not that the knowledge was lost. It is that the institutional momentum of a production machine making its 22nd season of a long-running show is very resistant to the application of that knowledge, because applying it would require slowing down, reconsidering, being uncertain things that are incompatible with the pace and scale of late-season television production. The early seasons were made by people who were uncertain, in the productive way that new things are uncertain. They were figuring out what the show was. That uncertainty generated the specific quality of attention that made the work good. The later seasons were made by people who knew exactly what the show was, and that certainty was one of the conditions of the work being worse. This is not a paradox. It is a specific truth about how creative work operates over time. The things that make beginnings generative, the uncertainty, the genuine discovery, the feeling of making something that has not been made before, are not available to the same project in its 20th year. The only way to recover them is to find new questions, new genuine uncertainties, new territory that has not yet been mapped. The best long-running shows find ways to keep discovering. Family Guy, after a certain point, stopped discovering and started maintaining. And maintenance, however competent, is not the same as creation. Thank you, genuinely and specifically, for spending this time with this story. If you found it worth your attention, a like and a subscription go a long way. Take care of yourselves. See you next time. End of script complete version. Extended reflections. The mechanics of comic friendship. The relationships between characters in a comedy are, in many ways, the show itself. Plot is the vehicle. Character relationships are the destination. What you are actually watching when you watch a sitcom or an animated comedy is the specific texture of how specific people relate to each other, the established rhythms of who says what to whom and why, and what happens next. Family Guy's most essential relationship was always Peter and Brian, not Peter and Lois, though that relationship mattered enormously to the show's emotional grounding. Not Stewie and Brian, though that partnership produced some of the show's most acclaimed material. The foundational relationship was Peter and his dog, the friendship at the center of everything else. What made the Peter-Brian friendship work in the early seasons was not that it was balanced. It was not. Brian was clearly the more intelligent and more emotionally mature of the two, and the show never pretended otherwise. The comedy of the friendship depended on that imbalance being genuine and stable. Brian was not going to become less perceptive or Peter more reflective. The asymmetry was fixed, and the fixed asymmetry was the comedy engine. But the friendship worked because both participants needed it in real ways. Peter needed Brian because Brian was the one person in his life who saw him clearly and still chose to be his friend. This is not a small thing. Being genuinely seen and still genuinely chosen is one of the most valuable experiences available to a person. And Peter, who moved through the world largely impervious to accurate self-assessment, had in Brian a friend who knew exactly how limited Peter was and had decided that the whole package was worth the trouble. This made Brian's friendship one of the most affirming things in Peter's life. Even when Brian was being critical or exasperated, Brian needed Peter because Peter gave him access to a kind of uncomplicated joy and spontaneity that Brian's own temperament would never have generated independently. Brian was too self-conscious, too burdened by his own unfulfilled ambitions and his awareness of his own limitations, to throw himself into experience the way Peter did. The friendship with Peter was, for Brian, a form of vacation from himself. Peter's enthusiastic obliviousness was, in its way, a kind of freedom that Brian envied even while he found it exasperating. This mutual need was the emotional reality underneath the comedy. It made the jokes that came from their dynamic feel grounded in something true rather than just manufactured. When Brian rolled his eyes at something Peter had said or done, The eye roll was funny not just because it was a good take on an absurd situation, but because you understood the specific relationship inside which the eye roll was occurring. Brian was not a random sardonic presence commenting on a buffoon. He was a specific person in a specific friendship that required exactly this kind of response. The later seasons compromised this relationship in two simultaneous directions. Peter became cruder and more selfishly oblivious in ways that made his end of the friendship less reciprocal, less something that Brian was genuinely choosing, and more something that Brian was simply enduring. And Brian became more self-absorbed and more dishonest in ways that made the intelligence that justified his side of the friendship feel increasingly hollow. The friendship that had been built on genuine mutual need and genuine mutual affection became something more performative, executed through established routines rather than felt from moment to moment. The loss of the genuine Peter-Brian friendship was, in some ways, the loss that preceded all the other losses. It was the relationship at the center of the show's emotional infrastructure, and once it became hollow, the infrastructure as a whole was compromised. Extended reflections, the question of audience, and who gets to be the main character. One of the more interesting formal questions Family Guy navigated across its run was the question of who the show was actually centered on. The title suggests a collective, the Griffin family, plural, a domestic unit rather than a single protagonist. But television comedies almost always organize around a central figure, and Family Guy was no exception. In the early seasons, the center of gravity was genuinely shared in a way that was somewhat unusual. Peter was the most active character, the one who generated most of the plots through his bad decisions. But Brian was, in many ways, the audience's point of identification, the perspective character through whom the chaos was filtered and understood. And Stewie functioned as a kind of wild card, the element of genuine unpredictability that could enter any scene and shift its energy completely. This distributed center created a kind of narrative generosity that is relatively rare. Different viewers connected with different aspects of the show, and the show was rich enough to support multiple points of entry. You could be a Peter fan, or a Brian fan, or a Stewie fan, or someone who watched primarily for Lois's patient sanity, or for the Joe and Quagmire and Cleveland friendship dynamic, and the show would have been giving you what you came for in every episode. As the show evolved, this distributed quality contracted. Peter became more dominant, not in the sense that he got more screen time, which was always substantial, but in the sense that his energy increasingly defined the show's tone. And the tone Peter defined in the later seasons was aggressive and blunt and loud, which crowded out the more varied and more textured comedy that had characterized the earlier episodes. Brian's evolution toward the show's most controversial character, rather than its most relatable one, was particularly consequential for the audience relationship. Brian had functioned as the access point for viewers who were not primarily cartoon slapstick fans, viewers who connected with the character-driven comedy, the dry observation, the quiet humanity of the best early Brian scenes. As Brian became more obnoxious and more difficult to root for, those viewers lost their access point. The show was less available to them, not because they had changed, but because the character that had been their way into the show had become something they could no longer identify with. Meg's transformation from relatable, ordinary teenager into sustained abuse target had a similar effect on a different audience segment. Female viewers and anyone who had experienced being on the wrong end of a family dynamic recognized Meg in those early seasons and found something real and somewhat moving in her situation. The show used that recognition and then abandoned it, replacing the relatable teenager with a punching bag. The viewers who had connected specifically with Meg lost not just a character they liked, but the validation that had come from seeing something of their own experience in her situation. The progressive narrowing of the show's audience address from generous and multifaceted to loud and monosyllabic was not a consequence of running out of ideas. It was a consequence of the specific ideas that were chosen, season after season, in a direction that served some audience segments and failed others. Extended reflections. Time and what it does. There is a version of the Family Guy story that is simply a story about time. About what time does to any creative endeavor that continues past the moment when it was first made with full urgency and full attention. About the entropy that sets into any system that keeps running after the energy that originally drove it has dissipated. Long-running American animated comedies have a particular relationship with time that is different from live-action shows in some important ways. The characters do not age. The actors do not age visibly inside the performances. The world of the show can be reset to baseline more completely after each episode than a live-action show can manage, because nothing in animation accumulates the way physical reality accumulates. A live-action character cannot walk away from a catastrophic injury looking completely fine the next episode because the actor's face and body carry the evidence of the preceding episode. An animated character can, and does. This capacity for perfect reset is both a gift and a trap. It is a gift because it allows an animated comedy to remain flexible across many seasons in ways that serialized drama cannot. The Griffins can have enormous adventures without any of them permanently changing the character. Relationships, because the show can simply return to baseline. It is a trap because the same mechanism that allows for reset allows for stagnation. The characters do not have to grow because the show can keep resetting them. The relationships do not have to develop because they can keep being restored to their previous configuration. The show can keep going without anything genuinely changing, and eventually, without anything genuinely changing becomes the defining characteristic of the experience. The best long-running animated shows find ways to create the impression of change and growth within a format that structurally resists permanent change. The Simpsons at its peak did this, finding ways to explore the depth of its characters' interior lives even within episodes that would end with the status quo essentially restored. American Dad does this, allowing its characters to accumulate experiences that subtly alter how they move through the world even if their basic configurations remain stable. Family Guy, in its later seasons, gave up on even the impression of meaningful change. The episodes that appeared to address character growth or relationship development were routinely followed by episodes that restored the prior baseline without acknowledgement of what had come before. The show seemed to have concluded that continuity was too expensive a proposition, that the work of maintaining a record of what had happened to these people and how it had affected them was not worth the benefit it would provide to viewers who were paying enough attention to notice it. This was a specific creative choice, not an inevitability. The mechanics of animation do not require reset. American Dad runs in the same format with the same structural flexibility and uses that flexibility differently. The choice to reset was made by people who, at some point, decided that maintaining continuity was not worth the effort, or who were simply not thinking about it because the episode-by-episode process of production had crowded out any longer view of what the show was building toward. Time did not ruin Family Guy. The choices made across the years of Family Guy's production ruined Family Guy. Time was the medium through which those choices accumulated into something large enough to be visible. But the choices were made by people, not by clocks. This is the whole story, all of it, laid out in the detail it deserves. Family Guy was great, and then it was less great, and then it was less great than that, and the trail of reasons leads back to specific decisions made over specific seasons by specific people. The greatness was real. The decline was real. Both of these things are true simultaneously, and neither one cancels the other. If you've stayed with this all the way to the end genuinely, thank you. You are exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. Leave a like if the video gave you something. Subscribe if you want more of this kind of thing. And take care of yourself out there. See you next time. Complete script end. A note on what this kind of analysis costs. Writing about a show you once loved is a strange thing to do. It requires you to hold two states simultaneously: the affection for what it was and the honest accounting of what it became, without letting either one collapse into the other. The affection cannot be allowed to soften the honest accounting, because dishonest affection is just sentimentality, and sentimentality serves no one. The honest accounting cannot be allowed to crowd out the affection, because affection is where the whole story starts and ends, and a script like this, without the genuine love underneath it, is just criticism, which is a different and lesser thing. Family Guy was genuinely loved, not just watched, loved, in the specific way that creative work can be loved when it arrives at exactly the right moment and does exactly the right things. The people who were watching in 1999, or who discovered the Adult Swim reruns in 2003, or who wore out their DVD copies in the years before the revival, those people did not just have a television habit. They had a relationship with something that felt like it had been made specifically for them, that understood the specific combination of dark humor and genuine warmth they were looking for in a way that other shows of the era did not. That feeling of being understood by a piece of entertainment is relatively rare and worth acknowledging when it happens. Family Guy, for a specific stretch of years to a specific group of people, created that feeling. The show did something right. Something that resonated at a level that went beyond craft into connection. The story of how it stopped doing that thing is worth telling precisely because the feeling was real. A story about the decline of something nobody cared about would be only mildly interesting, a kind of forensic inventory. This story is more than that because the original investment was more than casual. The people who felt the decline most acutely were the people who had been most genuinely engaged with what the show had been, and their frustration was proportional to their prior affection. That proportionality is where the genuine sadness of the story lives, not in the decline itself, which is observable and documentable, but in the gap between the potential that the early seasons demonstrated and the use made of that potential over the following 2 decades. The show proved it could be excellent. It proved this extensively and consistently for 3 seasons, and then again in flashes across the revival years, and then in individual episodes scattered across a very long run. The proof was there. The capacity was demonstrated, and then the capacity was consistently not used at its full potential for reasons that were chosen rather than necessary. That is the kind of story that stays with you, not the story of something that was always limited, the story of something that was not limited, that showed you what it could be, and then made different choices. The final accounting. So here is where we end up after all of this. Family Guy premiered to 22 million viewers and a genuine sense of discovery. It was canceled, resurrected through the loyalty of a cult audience, revived to genuine commercial success, and then gradually transformed by the accumulation of specific creative decisions into something much smaller and much less vital than what it had been. The transformation was not random. It was not mysterious. It was the product of identifiable choices. The Flanderization of Peter from lovable to cruel, the conversion of Brian from genuine intellect to pretentious fraud, the retirement of evil Stewie in favor of something more available and less original, the sustained abuse of Meg across a decade of episodes, the expansion of cutaway gags from seasoning to main course, the replacement of wit with shock value, the departure of MacFarlane from active creative involvement, and the continued production of the show long past the point where the conditions for genuine creative excellence were present. Each of these choices had reasons. None of them was made from pure carelessness or indifference. The people making Family Guy in its middle and late seasons were talented professionals doing their jobs. But talent and professionalism are not sufficient protections against drift, and the drift accumulated across 20-plus seasons into something substantial. American Dad, running alongside Family Guy in the same production universe, demonstrated that the drift was not inevitable. Different choices led to different outcomes. The comparison is the clearest evidence available that what happened to Family Guy was chosen rather than fated. The ratings followed the quality, as they ultimately tend to do. Not immediately, not precisely, not in a clean one-to-one correspondence. But over time, the audience that had come to Family Guy for what it had been at its best found less and less of that thing and more of what had replaced it, and they made the decision, in their millions, to spend their time elsewhere. The show is still on television. It will be on television for years, sustained by Disney's investment and the economics of animated production and the brand recognition of 25 years of cultural presence. It may produce episodes that are genuinely good. The talent in the recording booth has never been the problem, and the talent in the writing room still exists, even if it is not always deployed at its highest level. Individual episodes of late-season Family Guy can still be very funny. The form is intact, but the specific magic of the early seasons, the combination of genuine warmth and sharp writing, and original characters, and unified vision, and evident love for the material, that magic was specific to a time and a set of conditions that no longer exist. The show that is being made today is a different show from the one that premiered in 1999, and the distance between them is the distance this script has been tracing. The early seasons remain. Watch them if you have not. Watch them again if you have. They hold up, they are as good as they ever were, and they are evidence, permanent and specific, that Family Guy knew how to be great. What it did with that knowledge over the following 20 years is, in the end, the saddest part of the whole story. Thank you for watching, genuinely. Subscribe, leave a like, let me know in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is. It helps more than you know. See you next time.